Chapter 20 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 20. Arkwright's Eyes Are Opened. William came back from his business trip the 8th of July, and on the 9th Billy and Bertram went to New York. Eliza's mother was so well now that Eliza had taken up her old quarters in the Strata, and the household affairs were once more running like clockwork. Later in the season William would go away for a month's fishing trip, and the house would be closed. Mr. and Mrs. Bertram Henshaw were not expected to return until the 1st of October, but with Eliza to look after the comfort of William, the mistress of the house did no worrying. Ever since Pete's going, Eliza had said that she preferred to be the only maid, with a charwoman to come in for the heavier work, and to this arrangement her mistress had willingly consented for the present. Marie and the babies were doing finely, and Aunt Hannah's health and affairs at the Annex were all that could be desired. As Billy indeed saw it, there was only one flaw to mar her perfect content on this holiday trip with Bertram, and that was her disappointment over the very evident disaster that had come to her cherished matrimonial plans for Arkwright and Alice Greggory. She could not forget Arkwright's face that day at the Annex, when she had so foolishly called his attention to Calderwell's devotion, and she could not forget either Alice Greggory's very obvious perturbation a little later, and her suspiciously emphatic assertion that she had no intention of marrying anyone, certainly not Arkwright. As Billy thought of all this now, she could not but admit that it did look dark for Arkwright. Poor Arkwright, whom she, more than anyone else in the world perhaps, had a special reason for wishing to see happily married. There was then this one cloud on Billy's horizon as the big boat that was to bear her across the water steamed down the harbor that beautiful July day. As it chanced, naturally perhaps, not only was Billy thinking of Arkwright that morning, but Arkwright was thinking of Billy. Arkwright had thought frequently of Billy during the last few days, particularly since that afternoon meeting at the Annex, when the four had renewed their old good times together. Up to that day, Arkwright had been trying not to think of Billy. He had been fighting his tiger skin. Sternly he had been forcing himself to meet her, to see her, to talk with her, to sing with her, or to pass her by, all with the indifference properly expected to be shown in association with Mrs. Bertram Henshaw, another man's wife. He had known, of course, that deep down in his heart he loved her, always had loved her, and always would love her. Hopelessly and drearily he accepted this as a fact, even while with all his might fighting that tiger skin. So sure was he indeed of this, so implicitly had he accepted it as an unalterable certainty, that in time even his efforts to fight it became almost mechanical and unconscious in their stern round of forced indifference. Then came that day at the Annex, and the discovery which he had made when Billy called his attention to Calderwell and Alice Greggory across the room in the corner. The discovery which had come with so blinding a force, and which even now he was tempted to question as to its reality. The discovery that not Billy Neilson, nor Mrs. Bertram Henshaw, nor even the tender ghost of a lost love held the center of his heart, but Alice Greggory. The first intimation of all this had come with his curious feeling of unreasoning hatred and blind indignation toward Calderwell, as through Billy's eyes he had seen the two together. Then had come the overwhelming longing to pick up Alice Greggory and run off with her, somewhere, anywhere, so that Calderwell could not follow. At once, however, he had pulled himself up short with the mental cry of absurd. What was it to him if Calderwell did care for Alice Greggory? Surely he himself was not in love with the girl. He was in love with Billy. That is... It was all confusion then in his mind, and he was glad indeed when he could leave the house. He wanted to be alone. He wanted to think. He must in some way thrash out this astounding thing that had come to him. Arkwright did not visit the annex again for some days. Until he was more nearly sure of himself and of his feelings, he did not wish to see Alice Greggory. It was then that he began to think of Billy, deliberately, purposefully, for it must be, of course, that he had made a mistake, he told himself. It must be that he did really still care for Billy, though of course he ought not to. Arkwright made another discovery then. He learned that, however deliberately he started in to think of Billy, he ended every time in thinking of Alice. He thought of how good she had been to him, and of how faithful she had been in helping him to fight his love for Billy. Just here he decided for a moment that probably, after all, his feeling of anger against Calderwell was merely the fear of losing this helpful comradeship that he so needed. Even with himself, however, Arkwright could not keep up this farce long, and very soon he admitted miserably that it was not the comradeship of Alice Greggory that he wanted or needed, but the love. He knew it now. No longer was there any use in beating about the bush. He did love Alice Greggory, but so curiously and unbelievably stupid had he been that he had not found it out until now. And now it was too late. Had not even Billy called his attention to the fact of Calderwell's devotion? Besides, had not he himself, at the very first, told Calderwell that he might have a clear field? Fool that he had been to let another thus lightly step in and win from under his very nose what might have been his if he had but known his own mind before it was too late. But was it, after all, quite too late? He and Alice were old friends. Away back in their young days, in their native town, they had been, indeed, almost sweethearts, in a boy and girl fashion. It would not have taken much in those days, he believed, to have made the relationship more interesting. But changes had come. Alice had left town, and for years they had drifted apart. Then had come Billy, and Billy had found Alice, thus bringing about the odd circumstance of their renewing of acquaintanceship. Perhaps at that time, if he had not already thought he cared for Billy, there would have been something more than acquaintanceship. But he had thought he cared for Billy all these years, and now, at this late day, to wake up and find that he cared for Alice! A pretty mess he had made of things. Was he so inconstant then, so fickle? Did he not know his own mind 5 minutes at a time? What would Alice Greggory think, even if he found the courage to tell her? What could she think? What could anybody think? Arkwright fairly ground his teeth in impotent wrath, and he did not know whether he were the most angry that he did not love Billy, or that he had loved Billy, or that he loved somebody else now. It was while he was in this unenviable frame of mind that he went to see Alice. Not that he had planned definitely to speak to her of his discovery, nor yet that he had planned not to. He had indeed planned nothing. For a man usually so decided as to purpose and energetic as to action, he was in a most unhappy state of uncertainty and changeableness. One thing only was unmistakably clear to him, and that was that he must see Alice. For months now he had taken to Alice all his hopes and griefs, perplexities and problems, and never had he failed to find comfort in the shape of sympathetic understanding and wise counsel. To Alice, therefore, now he turned as a matter of course, telling himself vaguely that, perhaps, after he had seen Alice, he would feel better. Just how intimately this particular problem of his concerned Alice herself, he did not stop to realize. He did not, indeed, think of it at all from Alice's standpoint, until he came face to face with the girl in the living-room at the Annex. Then suddenly he did. His manner became at once, consequently, full of embarrassment and quite devoid of its usual frank friendliness. As it happened, this was perhaps the most unfortunate thing that could have occurred, so far as it concerned the attitude of Alice Greggory, for thereby innumerable tiny sparks of suspicion that had been tormenting the girl for days were instantly fanned into consuming flames of conviction. Alice had not been slow to note Arkwright's prolonged absence from the Annex. Coming, as it did, so soon after her most disconcerting talk with Billy in regard to her own relations with him, it had filled her with frightened questionings. If Billy had seen things to make her think of linking their names together, perhaps Arkwright himself had heard some such idea put forth somewhere, and that was why he was staying away, to show the world that there was no foundation for such rumors. Perhaps he was even doing it to show her that. Even in her thoughts, Alice could scarcely bring herself to finish the sentence. That Arkwright should ever suspect for a moment that she cared for him was intolerable. Painfully conscious as she was that she did care for him, it was easy to fear that others must be conscious of it too. Had she not already proof that Billy suspected it? Why, then might not it be quite possible, even probable, that Arkwright suspected it also, and because he did suspect it, had decided that it would be just as well, perhaps, if he did not call so often. In spite of Alice's angry insistence to herself that, after all, this could not be the case, that the man knew she understood he still loved Billy, she could not help fearing, in the face of Arkwright's unusual absence, that it might yet be true. When, therefore, he finally did appear, only to become at once obviously embarrassed in her presence, her fears instantly became convictions. It was true, then. The man did believe she cared for him, and he had been trying to teach her, to save her. To teach her! To save her, indeed! Very well, he should see. And forthwith, from that moment, Alice Greggory's chief reason for living became to prove to Mr. M.J. Arkwright that he needed not to teach her, to save her, nor yet to sympathize with her. "How do you do?" she greeted him with a particularly bright smile. "I'm sure I hope you are well, such a beautiful day as this."
"Oh, yes, I'm well, I suppose. Still, I have felt better in my life,"
smiled Arkwright with some constraint. "Oh, I'm sorry," murmured the girl, striving so hard to speak with impersonal unconcern that she did not notice the inaptness of her reply.
"Eh? Sorry I've felt better, are you?"
retorted Arkwright with nervous humor. Then, because he was embarrassed, he said the one thing he had meant not to say.
"Don't you think I'm quite a stranger? It's been some time since I've been here."
Alice, smarting under the sting of what she judged to be the only possible cause for his embarrassment, leaped to this new opportunity to show her lack of interest. "Oh, has it?" she murmured carelessly.
Well, I don't know but it has, now that I come to think of it. Arkwright frowned gloomily. A week ago he would have tossed back a laughingly aggrieved remark as to her unflattering indifference to his presence. Now he was in no mood for such joking. It was too serious a matter with him. "You've been busy, no doubt, with other matters," he presumed forlornly, thinking of Calderwell. "Yes, I have been busy," assented the girl. "One is always happier, I think, to be busy. Not that I meant that I needed the work to be happy," she added hastily, in a panic lest he think she had a consuming sorrow to kill. "No, of course not," he murmured abstractedly, rising to his feet and crossing the room to the piano. Then, with an elaborate air of trying to appear very natural, he asked jovially, "Anything new to play to me?" Alice arose at once. "Yes, I have a little nocturne that I was playing to Mr. Calderwell last night." "Oh, to Calderwell?" Arkwright had stiffened perceptibly. "Yes, he didn't like it. I'll play it to you and see what you say," she smiled, seating herself at the piano. "Well, if he had liked it, it's safe to say I shouldn't," shrugged Arkwright. "Nonsense," laughed the girl, beginning to appear more like her natural self. "I should think you were Mr. Cyril Henshaw. Mr. Calderwell is partial to ragtime, I'll admit, but there are some good things he likes." "There are indeed some good things he likes," returned Arkwright with grim emphasis, his somber eyes fixed on what he believed to be the one especial object of Calderwell's affections at the moment. Alice, unaware both of the melancholy gaze bent upon herself and of the cause thereof, laughed again merrily. "Poor Mr. Calderwell!" she cried, as she let her fingers slide into soft introductory chords. "He isn't to blame for not liking what he calls our lost spirits that wail. It's just the way he's made." Arkwright vouchsafed no reply. With an abrupt gesture he turned and began to pace the room moodily. At the piano, Alice slipped from the chords into the nocturne. She played it straight through then, with a charm and skill that brought Arkwright's feet to a pause before it was half finished. "By George, that's great!" he breathed when the last tone had quivered into silence. "Yes, isn't it beautiful?" she murmured. The room was very quiet, and in semi-darkness. The last rays of a late June sunset had been filling the room with golden light, but it was gone now. Even at the piano by the window, Alice had barely been able to see clearly enough to read the notes of her nocturne. To Arkwright the air still trembled with the exquisite melody that had but just left her fingers. A quick fire came to his eyes. He forgot everything but that it was Alice there in the half-light by the window, Alice, whom he loved. With a low cry he took a swift step toward her. "Alice!" Instantly the girl was on her feet, but it was not toward him that she turned. It was away, resolutely and with a haste that was strangely like terror. Alice too had forgotten for just a moment. She had let herself drift into a dream world where there was nothing but the music she was playing and the man she loved. Then the music had stopped, and the man had spoken her name. Alice remembered then. She remembered Billy, whom this man loved. She remembered the long days just past when this man had stayed away, presumably to teach her, to save her. And now, at the sound of his voice speaking her name, she had almost bared her heart to him. No wonder that Alice, with a haste that looked like terror, crossed the floor and flooded the room with light. "Dear me," she shivered, carefully avoiding Arkwright's eyes. "If Mr. Calderwell were here now, he'd have some excuse to talk about our lost spirits that wail. That is a creepy piece of music when you play it in the dark.
and for fear that he should suspect how her heart was aching, she gave a particularly brilliant and joyous smile. Once again, at the mention of Calderwell's name, Arkwright stiffened perceptibly. The fire left his eyes. For a moment he did not speak. Then gravely he said, "Calderwell? Yes, perhaps he would. And you ought to be a judge, I should think. You see him quite frequently, don't you?" "Why, yes, of course. He often comes out here, you know." "Yes, I had heard that he did, since you came." His meaning was unmistakable. Alice looked up quickly. A prompt denial of his implication was on her lips when the thought came to her that perhaps just here lay a sure way to prove to this man before her that there was indeed no need for him to teach her, to save her, or yet to sympathize with her. She could not affirm, of course, but she need not deny yet. "Nonsense," she laughed lightly, pleased that she could feel what she hoped would pass for a telltale color burning her cheeks. "Come, let us try some duets," she proposed, leading the way to the piano. And Arkwright, interpreting the apparently embarrassed change of subject exactly as she had hoped that he would interpret it, followed her sick at heart. "Oh, wert thou in the cold blast," sang Arkwright's lips a few moments later. "I can't tell her now, when I know she cares for Calderwell," gloomily ran his thoughts the while. "It would do no possible good, and would only make her unhappy to grieve me." "Oh, wert thou in the cold blast," chimed in Alice's alto, low and sweet. "I reckon now he won't be staying away from here any more just to save me," ran Alice's thoughts, palpitatingly triumphant. End of Chapter 20. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette.
Chapter 21 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 21. Billy Takes Her Turn at Questioning. Arkwright did not call to see Alice Greggory for some days. He did not want to see Alice now. He told himself wearily that she could not help him fight this tiger skin that lay across his path. The very fact of her presence on his side would indeed incapacitate himself for fighting. So he deliberately stayed away from the Annex until the day before he sailed for Germany. Then he went out to say good-bye. Chagrined as he was at what he termed his imbecile stupidity in not knowing his own heart all these past months, and convinced as he also was that Alice and Calderwell cared for each other, he could see no way but for him to play the part of a man of kindliness and honor, leaving a clear field for his preferred rival, and bringing no shadow of regret to mar the happiness of the girl he loved. As for being his old, easy, frank self on this last call, however, that was impossible. So Alice found plenty of fuel for her still burning fires of suspicion, fires which had indeed blazed up anew at this second long period of absence on the part of Arkwright. Naturally, therefore, the call was anything but a joy and comfort to either one. Arkwright was nervous, gloomy, and abnormally gay by turns. Alice was nervous and abnormally gay all the time. Then they said good-bye, and Arkwright went away. He sailed the next day, and Alice settled down to the summer of study and hard work she had laid out for herself. On the 10th of September Billy came home. She was brown, plump-cheeked, and smiling. She declared that she had had a perfectly beautiful time, and that there couldn't be anything in the world nicer than the trip she and Bertram had taken, just they two together. In answer to Aunt Hannah's solicitous inquiries, she asserted that she was all well and rested now, but there was a vaguely troubled questioning in her eyes that Aunt Hannah did not quite like. Aunt Hannah, however, said nothing even to Billy herself about this. One of the first friends Billy saw after her return was Hugh Calderwell. As it happened, Bertram was out when he came, so Billy had the first half-hour of the call to herself. She was not sorry for this, as it gave her a chance to question Calderwell a little concerning Alice Greggory, something she had long ago determined to do at the first opportunity. "Now tell me everything about everybody," she began diplomatically, settling herself comfortably for a good visit. "Thank you, I'm well, and have had a passably agreeable summer, barring the heat, sundry persistent mosquitoes, several grievous disappointments, and a felon on my thumb," he began with shameless imperturbability. "I have been to Revere once, to the circus once, to Nantasket 3 times, and to Keith's and the movies 10 times, perhaps, to be accurate. I have also— But perhaps there was someone else you desired to inquire for?" he broke off, turning upon his hostess a bland but unsmiling countenance. "Oh, no, how could there be?" twinkled Billy. "Really, Hugh, I always knew you had a pretty good opinion of yourself, but I didn't credit you with thinking you were everybody. Go on, I'm so interested." Hugh chuckled softly, but there was a plaintive tone in his voice as he answered, "Thanks, no, I've rather lost my interest now. Lack of appreciation always did discourage me. We'll talk of something else, please. You enjoyed your trip?" "Very much. It just couldn't have been nicer." "You were lucky. The heat here has been something fierce. What made you stay?" "Reasons too numerous, and one too heartbreaking to mention. Besides, you forget," with dignity, "there is my profession. I have joined the workers of the world now, you know." "Oh, fudge, Hugh," laughed Billy. "You know very well you're as likely as not to start for the ends of the earth tomorrow morning." Hugh drew himself up. "I don't seem to succeed in making people understand that I'm serious," he began aggrievedly. With an expressive flourish of his hands, he relaxed suddenly and fell back in his chair. A slow smile came to his lips. "Well, Billy, I'll give up. You've hit it," he confessed. "I have thought seriously of starting tomorrow morning for halfway to the ends of the earth, Panama." "You!" "Well, I have. Even this call was to be a good-bye if I went." "Oh, Hugh, but I really thought, in spite of my teasing, that you had settled down this time." "Yes, so did I," sighed the man, a little soberly. "But I guess it's no use, Billy. Oh, I'm coming back, of course, and link arms again with their worthy highnesses, John Doe and Richard Doe. But just now I've got a restless fit on me. I want to see the wheels go round. Of course, if I had my bread and butter and cigars to earn, 'twould be different. But I haven't, and I know I haven't, and I suspect that's where the trouble lies. If it wasn't for those natal silver spoons of mine that Bertram is always talking about, things might be different. But the spoons are there, and always have been, and I know they're all ready to dish out mountains to climb and lakes to paddle in any time I've a mind to say the word. So I just say the word. That's all." "And you said it now?" "Yes, I think so, for a while." "And those reasons that have kept you here all summer," ventured Billy, "they aren't in commission any longer?" "No." Billy hesitated, regarding her companion meditatively. Then, with the feeling that she had followed a blind alley to its termination, she retreated and made a fresh start. "Well, you haven't yet told me everything about everybody, you know," she hinted smilingly. "You might begin that. I mean the less important everybodies, of course, now that I've heard about you." "Meaning?" "Oh, Aunt Hannah, and the Greggorys, and Cyril, and Marie, and the twins, and Mr. Arkwright, and all the rest." "But you've had letters, surely?" "Yes, I've had letters from some of them, and I've seen most of them since I came back. It's just that I wanted to know your viewpoint of what's happened through the summer." "Very well. Aunt Hannah is as dear as ever, wears just as many shawls, and still keeps her clock striking 12 when it's 11:30. Mrs. Greggory is just as sweet as ever, and a little more frail, I fear, bless her heart. Mr. Arkwright is still abroad, as I presume you know. I hear he is doing great stunts over there, and will sing in Berlin and Paris this winter. I'm thinking of going across from Panama later. If I do, I shall look him up. Mr. and Mrs. Cyril are as well as could be expected, when you realize that they haven't yet settled on a pair of names for the twins. I know it, and the poor little thing's 3 months old, too. I think it's a shame. You've heard the reason, I suppose. Cyril declares that naming babies is one of the most serious and delicate operations in the world, and that for his part he thinks people ought to select their own names when they've arrived at years of discretion. He wants to wait till the twins are 18, and then make each of them a birthday present of the name of their choosing. Well, if that isn't the limit, laughed Calderwell. I've heard some such thing before, but I hadn't supposed it was really so. Well, it is. He says he knows more tomboys and enormous fat women called Grace and Lily, and sweet little mouse-like ladies staggering along under a sonorous Jerusa Theodosia or Zebaniah Jane, and that if he should name the boys Franz and Felix, after Schubert and Mendelssohn, as Marie wants to, they'd as likely as not turn out to be men who hated the sound of music and doted on stocks and dry goods. Huh, grunted Calderwell. I saw Cyril last week, and he said he hadn't named the twins yet, but he didn't tell me why. I offered him 2 perfectly good names myself, but he didn't seem interested. What were they? Eldad and Bildad. Hugh, protested Billy. Well, why not? Bridled the man. I'm sure those are new and unique, and really musical, too, way ahead of your Franz and Felix. But those aren't really names. Indeed they are. Where did you get them? Off our family tree, though they're Bible names, Belle says. Perhaps you didn't know, but Sister Belle has been making the dirt fly quite lively of late around that family tree of ours, and she wrote me some of her discoveries. It seems 2 of the roots, or branches, say, our ancestors' roots or branches, were called Eldad and Bildad. Now, I thought those names were good enough to pass along, but as I said before, Cyril wasn't interested. I should say not, laughed Billy. But honestly, Hugh, it's really serious. Marie wants them named something, but she doesn't say much to Cyril. Marie wouldn't really breathe, you know, if she thought Cyril disapproved of breathing. And in this case, Cyril does not hesitate to declare that the boys shall name themselves. What a situation, laughed Calderwell. Isn't it? But do you know, I can sympathize with it in a way, for I've always mourned so over my name. Billy was always such a trial to me. Poor Uncle William wasn't the only one that prepared guns and fishing rods to entertain the expected boy. I don't know, though. I'm afraid if I'd been allowed to select my name, I should have been a Helen Clarabella all my days, for that was the name I gave all my dolls, with first, second, third, and so on, added to them for distinction. Evidently I thought that Helen Clarabella was the most feminine appellation possible, and the most foreign to the despised Billy. So you see, I can sympathize with Cyril to a certain extent. But they must call the little chap something now, argued Hugh. Billy gave a sudden merry laugh. They do, she gurgled, and that's the funniest part of it. Oh, Cyril doesn't. He always calls them impersonally they or it. He doesn't see much of them anyway now, I understand. Marie was horrified when she realized how the nurses had been using his den as a nursery annex, and she changed all that instanter when she took charge of things again. The twins stay in the nursery now, I'm told. But about the names, the nurses, it seems, have got into the way of calling them Dot and Dimple. One has a dimple in his cheek, and the other is a little smaller of the two. Marie is no end distressed, particularly as she finds that she herself calls them that, and she says the idea of boys being Dot and Dimple. I should say so, laughed Calderwell. Not I regard that as worse than my Eldad and Bildad. I know it. And Alice says, by the way, you haven't mentioned Alice, but I suppose you see her occasionally? Billy paused in evident expectation of a reply. Billy was, in fact, quite pluming herself on the adroit casualness with which she had introduced the subject nearest her heart. Calderwell raised his eyebrows. "Oh, yes, I see her. But you hadn't mentioned her." There was the briefest of pauses. Then, with a half-quizzical dejection, there came the remark. "You seem to forget. I told you that I stayed here this summer for reasons too numerous and one too heartbreaking to mention. She was the one." "You mean—" "Yes, the usual thing. She turned me down. Oh, I haven't asked her yet as many times as I did you, but—" "Hugh!" Hugh tossed her a grim smile and went on imperturbably. "I'm older now, of course, and know more, perhaps. Besides, the finality of her remarks was not to be mistaken." Billy, in spite of her sympathy for Calderwell, was conscious of a throb of relief that at least one stumbling block was removed from Arkwright's possible pathway to Alice's heart. "Did she give any special reason?" hazarded Billy, a shade too anxiously. "Oh, yes. She said she wasn't going to marry anybody, only her music." "Nonsense!" ejaculated Billy, falling back in her chair a little. "Yes, I said that, too," gloomed the man, "but it didn't do any good. You see, I had known another girl who'd said the same thing once." He did not look up, but a vivid red flamed suddenly into Billy's cheeks. "And she, when the right one came, forgot all about the music and married the man. So I naturally suspected that Alice would do the same thing. In fact, I said so to her. I was bold enough to even call the man by name. I hadn't been jealous of Arkwright for nothing, you see, but she denied it and flew into such an indignant allegation that there wasn't a word of truth in it that I had to sue for pardon before I got anything like peace." "Oh," said Billy, in a disappointed voice, falling quite back in her chair this time. "And so that's why I'm wanting especially just now to see the wheels go round," smiled Calderwell, a little wistfully. "Oh, I shall get over it, I suppose. It isn't the first time, I'll own. But some day I take it there will be a last time. Enough of this, however. You haven't told me a thing about yourself. How about it? When I come back, are you going to give me a dinner cooked by your own fair hands? Going to still play Bridget?" Billy laughed and shook her head. "No, far from it. Eliza has come back, and her cousin from Vermont is coming as second girl to help her. But I could cook a dinner for you, if I had to now, sir. And it wouldn't be potato mush and cold lamb," she bragged shamelessly, as there sounded Bertram's particular ring and the click of his key in the lock. It was the next afternoon that Billy called on Marie. From Marie's, Billy went to the Annex, which was very near Cyril's new house, and there, in Aunt Hannah's room, she had what she told Bertram afterwards was a perfectly lovely visit. Aunt Hannah, too, enjoyed the visit very much, though yet there was one thing that disturbed her, the vaguely troubled look in Billy's eyes, which today was more apparent than ever. Not until just before Billy went home did something occur to give Aunt Hannah a possible clue as to what was the meaning of it. That something was a question from Billy. "Aunt Hannah, why don't I feel like Marie did? Why don't I feel like everybody does in books and stories? Marie went around with such a detached, heavenly, absorbed look in her eyes before the twins came to her home, but I don't. I don't find anything like that in my face when I look in the glass. And I don't feel detached and absorbed and heavenly. I'm happy, of course, but I can't help thinking of the dear, dear times Bertram and I have together, just we two, and I can't seem to imagine it at all with a third person around." "Billy, third person, indeed!" "There, I knew 'twould shock you," mourned Billy. "It shocks me. I want to feel detached and heavenly and absorbed. But, Billy, dear, think of it! Calling your own baby a third person." Billy sighed despairingly. "Yes, I know, and I suppose I might as well own up to the rest of it, too. I'm actually afraid of babies, Aunt Hannah." "Well, I am," she reiterated, in answer to Aunt Hannah's gasp of disapproval. I'm not used to them at all. I never had any little brothers and sisters, and I don't know how to treat babies. I'm always afraid they'll break or something. I'm just as afraid of the twins as I can be. How Marie can handle them and toss them about as she does, I don't see. Toss them about, indeed. Well, it looks that way to me, sighed Billy. Anyhow, I know I could never get to handle them like that, and that's no way to feel. And I'm ashamed of myself because I can't be detached and heavenly and absorbed, she added, rising to go. Everybody always is, it seems, but just me. Fiddle-dee-dee, my dear, scoffed Aunt Hannah, patting Billy's downcast face. Wait till a year from now, and we'll see about that third-person bugaboo you're worrying about. I'm not worrying now, so you'd better not. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 22. A Dot and a Dimple. On the day Cyril Henshaw's twins were 6 months old, a momentous occurrence marked the date with a flaming red letter of remembrance. And it all began with a baby's smile. Cyril, in quest of his wife at about 10 o'clock that morning, and not finding her, pursued his search even to the nursery, a room he very seldom entered. Cyril did not like to go into the nursery. He felt ill at ease, as if he were away from home, and Cyril was known to abhor being away from home since he was married. Now that Marie had taken over the reins of government again, he had been obliged to see very little of those strange women and babies. Not but that he liked the babies, of course. They were his sons, and he was proud of them. They should have every advantage that college, special training, and travel could give them. He quite anticipated what they would be to him, when they really knew anything. But of course now, when they could do nothing but cry and wave their absurd little fists, and wobble their heads in so fearsome a manner, as if they simply did not know the meaning of the word backbone, and for that matter, of course, they didn't, why, he could not be expected to be anything but relieved when he had his den to himself again, with a reasonable chance of finding his manuscript as he had left it, and not cut up into a ridiculous string of paper dolls holding hands, as he had once found it after a visit from a woman with a small girl. Since Marie had been at the helm, however, he had not been troubled in such a way. He had indeed known almost his old customary peace and freedom from interruption, with only an occasional flitting across his path of the strange women and babies, though he had realized, of course, that they were in the house, especially in the nursery. For that reason, therefore, he always avoided the nursery when possible. But today he wanted his wife, and his wife was not to be found anywhere else in the house. So reluctantly he turned his steps toward the nursery, and with a frown knocked and pushed open the door. "Is Mrs. Henshaw here?" he demanded, not over gently. Absolute silence greeted his question. The man saw then that there was no one in the room save a baby sitting on a mat in the middle of the floor, barricaded on all sides with pillows. With a deeper frown the man turned to go, when a gleeful "Ah, goo!" halted his steps midway. He wheeled sharply. Eh?" he queried, uncertainly eyeing his small son on the floor. "Ah, goo!" observed the infant, who had been very lonesome, with greater emphasis, and this time he sent into his father's eyes the most bewitching of smiles. "Well, by George!" murmured the man, weakly, a dawning amazement driving the frown from his face. "Spow-wah!" gurgled the boy, holding out two tiny fists. A slow smile came to the man's face. "Well, I'll be darned!" he muttered half shamefacedly, wholly delightedly. "If the rascal doesn't act as if he knew me!" "Ah, goose, plish!" grinned the infant, toothlessly but entrancingly. With a stealthy touch Cyril closed the door back of him and advanced a little dubiously toward his son. His countenance carried a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and dogged determination so ludicrous that it was a pity none but the baby's eyes could see it. As if to meet more nearly on a level this baffling new acquaintance, Cyril got to his knees, somewhat stiffly it must be confessed, and faced his son. "Goo-ee-wah!" crowed the baby now, thrashing legs and arms about in a transport of joy at the acquisition of this new playmate. "Well, well, young man, you don't say so," stammered the growingly proud father, thrusting a plainly timid and unaccustomed finger toward his offspring. "So you do know me, eh? Well, who am I?" "Da," gurgled the boy triumphantly, clutching the outstretched finger and holding on with a tenacity that brought a gleeful chuckle to the lips of the man. "Jove, but aren't you the strong little beggar, though? Needn't tell me you don't know a good thing when you see it. So I'm am I?" he went on, unhesitatingly accepting as the pure gold of knowledge the shameless imitation vocabulary his son was foisting upon him. "Well, I expect I am, and—" "Oh, Cyril!" The door was opened, and Marie was in the room. If she gave a start of surprise at her husband's unaccustomed attitude, she quickly controlled herself. "Julia said you wanted me. I must have been going down the back stairs when you came up the front, and—" "Please, Mrs. Henshaw, is it Dot you have here, or Dimple?" asked a new voice, as the second nurse entered by another door. Before Mrs. Henshaw could answer, Cyril, who had got to his feet, turned abruptly. "Is it who?" he demanded. "Oh, Mr. Henshaw," stammered the girl. "I beg your pardon. I didn't know you were here. It was only that I wanted to know which baby it was. We thought we had Dot with us until—" "Dot? Dimple?" exploded the man. "Do you mean to say you have given my sons the ridiculous names of Dot and Dimple?" "Why, no. Yes. Well, that is, we had to call them something," faltered the nurse, as with a despairing glance at her mistress she plunged through the doorway. Cyril turned to his wife. "Marie, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Why, Cyril, dear, don't get so wrought up," she begged. "It's only as Mary said. We had to call them something, and—" "Wrought up, indeed!" interrupted Cyril savagely. "Who wouldn't be? Dot and Dimple? Great Scott! One would think those boys were a couple of kittens or puppies, that they didn't know anything, didn't have any brains. But they have. If the other is anything like this one, at least," he declared, pointing to his son on the floor, who at this opportune moment joined in the conversation to the extent of an appropriate "Ah-goo-da-da." "There, hear that, will you?" triumphed the father. "What did I tell you? That's the way he's been going on ever since I came into the room. The little rascal knows me so soon." Marie clapped her fingers to her lips and turned her back suddenly, with a spasmodic little cough, but her husband, if he noticed the interruption, paid no heed. "Dot and Dimple, indeed!" he went on wrathfully. "That settles it. We'll name those boys to-day, Marie, to-day. Not once again will I let the sun go down on a Dot and a Dimple under my roof." Marie turned with a quick little cry of happiness. "Oh, Cyril, I'm so glad! I've so wanted to have them named, you know. And shall we call them Franz and Felix, as we talked?" "Franz, Felix, John, James, Paul, Charles, anything, so it's sane and sensible. I'd even adopt Calderwell's absurd Bildad and, Tomdad, or whatever it was, rather than have those poor little chaps insulted a day longer with a Dot and a Dimple. Great Scott!" And entirely forgetting what he had come to the nursery for, Cyril strode from the room. "Ah, goose!" commented Baby from the middle of the floor. It was a very windy March day that Bertram Henshaw's son, Bertram Jr., arrived at the Strata. Billy went so far into the valley of the shadow of the death for her baby that it was some days before she realized, in all its importance, the presence of the new member of her family. Even when the days had become weeks, and Bertram Jr. was a month and a half old, the extreme lassitude and weariness of his young mother was a source of ever-growing anxiety to her family and friends. Billy was so unlike herself, they all said. If something could only rouse her, suggested the Henshaw's old family physician one day. A certain sort of mental shock, if not too severe, would do the deed, I think, and with no injury, only benefit. Her physical condition is in just the state that needs a stimulus to stir it into new life and vigor. As it happened, this was said on a certain Monday. 2 days later, Bertram's sister Kate, on her way with her husband to Mr. Hartwell's old home in Vermont, stopped over in Boston for a 2 days' visit. She made her headquarters at Cyril's home, but very naturally she went without much delay to pay her respects to Bertram, Jr. "Mr. Hartwell's brother isn't well," she explained to Billy after the greetings were over. "You know he's the only one left there since Mother and Father Hartwell came West. We shall go right on up to Vermont in a couple of days, but we just had to stay over long enough to see the baby, and we hadn't ever seen the twins either, you know. By the way, how perfectly ridiculous Cyril is over those boys." "Is he?" smiled Billy faintly. "Yes. One would think there were never any babies born before, to hear him talk. He thinks they're the most wonderful things in the world. They are cunning little fellows, I'll admit. But Cyril thinks they know so much," went on Kate, laughingly. "He's always bragging of something one or the other of them has done. Think of it, Cyril! Marie says it all started from the time last January when he discovered the nurses had been calling them Dot and Dimple." "Yes, I know," smiled Billy, again faintly, lifting a thin, white, very un-Billy-like hand to her head. Kate frowned and regarded her sister-in-law thoughtfully. "Mercy, how you look, Billy!" she exclaimed with cheerful tactlessness. "They said you did, but I declare you look worse than I thought." Billy's pale face reddened perceptibly. "Nonsense! It's just that I'm so tired," she insisted. "I shall be all right soon. How did you leave the children?" "Well and happy, especially little Kate, because Mother was going away. Kate is mistress, you know, when I'm gone, and she takes herself very seriously." "Mistress! A little thing like her! Why, she can't be more than 10 or 11, murmured Billy. "She isn't. She was 10 last month. But you'd think she was 40, the airs she gives herself sometimes. Oh, of course there's Nora and the cook and Miss Winton, the governess, there to really manage things, and Mother Hartwell is just around the corner. But little Kate thinks she's managing, so she's happy." Billy suppressed a smile. Billy was thinking that little Kate came naturally by at least one of her traits. "Really, that child is impossible sometimes," resumed Mrs. Hartwell with a sigh. "You know the absurd things she was always saying 2 or 3 years ago when we came on to Cyril's wedding?" "Yes, I remember." "Well, I thought she would get over it, but she doesn't. She's worse, if anything, and sometimes her insight or intuition, or whatever you may call it, is positively uncanny. I never know what she's going to remark next when I take her anywhere, but it's safe to say, whatever it is, it'll be unexpected and usually embarrassing to somebody. "And is that the baby?" broke off Mrs. Hartwell, as a cooing laugh and a woman's voice came from the next room. "Yes, the nurse has just brought him in, I think," said Billy. "Then I'll go right now and see him," rejoined Kate, rising to her feet and hurrying into the next room. Left alone, Billy lay back wearily in her reclining chair. She wondered why Kate always tired her so. She wished she had had on her blue kimono. Then perhaps Kate would not have thought she looked so badly. Blue was always more becoming to her than— Billy turned her head suddenly. From the next room had come Kate's clear-cut, decisive voice. "Oh, no, I don't think he looks a bit like his father. That little stubby nose was never the Henshaw nose." Billy drew in her breath sharply and pulled herself half erect in her chair. From the next room came Kate's voice again, after a low murmur from the nurse. "Oh, but he isn't, I tell you. He isn't one bit a Henshaw baby. The Henshaw babies are always pretty ones. They have more hair, and they look, well, different." Billy gave a low cry and struggled to her feet. "Oh, no," spoke up Kate, in answer to another indistinct something from the nurse. "I don't think he's near as pretty as the twins. Of course the twins are a good deal older, but they have such a bright look. And they did have from the very first. I saw it in their tiniest baby pictures. But this baby—" "This baby is mine, please," cut in a tremulous but resolute voice, and Mrs. Hartwell turned to confront Bertram Jr.'s mother, manifestly weak and trembling, but no less manifestly blazing-eyed and determined. "Why, Billy," expostulated Mrs. Hartwell, as Billy stumbled forward and snatched the child into her arms. "Perhaps he doesn't look like the Henshaw twins. Perhaps he isn't as pretty as the twins. Perhaps he hasn't much hair, and does have a snub nose. He's my baby just the same, and I shall not stay calmly by and see him abused. Besides, I think he's prettier than the twins ever thought of being, and he's got all the hair I want him to have, and his nose is just exactly what a baby's nose ought to be." With a superb gesture, Billy turned and bore the baby away. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 23. Billy and the Enormous Responsibility. When the doctor heard from the nurse of Mrs. Hartwell's visit and what had come of it, he only gave a discreet smile as befitted himself and the occasion, but to his wife privately that night the doctor said, when he had finished telling the story, "And I couldn't have prescribed a better pill if I'd tried." "Pill, Mrs. Hartwell!" "Oh, Harold!" reproved the doctor's wife mildly. But the doctor only chuckled the more and said, "You wait and see." If Billy's friends were worried before because of her lassitude and lack of ambition, they were almost as worried now over her amazing alertness and insistent activity. Day by day, almost hour by hour, she seemed to gain in strength, and every bit she acquired she promptly tested almost to the breaking point, so plainly eager was she to be well and strong. And always, from morning until night, and again from night until morning, the pivot of her existence, around which swung all thoughts, words, actions, and plans, was the sturdy little plump-cheeked, firm-fleshed atom of humanity known as Bertram Jr. Even Aunt Hannah remonstrated with her at last. "But, Billy, dear," she exclaimed, "one would almost get the idea that you thought there wasn't a thing in the world but that baby." Billy laughed. "Well, do you know, sometimes I most think there isn't," she retorted unblushingly. "Billy," protested Aunt Hannah. Then, a little severely, she demanded, "And who was it that just last September was calling this same only object in the world a third person in your home?" "Third person, indeed! Aunt Hannah, did I? Did I really say such a dreadful thing as that? But I didn't know then, of course. I couldn't know how perfectly wonderful a baby is, especially such a baby as Bertram Jr. is. Why, Aunt Hannah, that little thing knows a whole lot already. He's known me for weeks, I know he has, and ages ago he began to give me little smiles when he saw me. They were smiles, real smiles." "Oh, yes, I know Nurse said they weren't smiles at first," admitted Billy, in answer to Aunt Hannah's doubting expression. "I know Nurse said it was only wind on his stomach. Think of it, wind on his stomach! Just as if I didn't know the difference between my own baby smile and wind on his stomach. And you don't know how soon he began to follow my moving finger with his eyes." "Yes, I tried that one day, I remember," observed Aunt Hannah demurely. "I moved my finger. He looked at the ceiling fixedly." "Well, probably he wanted to look at the ceiling then," defended the young mother promptly. "I'm sure I wouldn't give a snap for a baby if he didn't sometimes have a mind of his own and exercise it." "Oh, Billy, Billy," laughed Aunt Hannah, with a shake of her head, as Billy turned away, chin uplifted. By the time Bertram Jr. was 3 months old, Billy was unmistakably her old happy, merry self, strong and well. Affairs of the strata once more were moving as by clockwork, only this time it was a baby's hand that set the clock and that wound it, too. Billy told her husband very earnestly that now they had entered upon a period of enormous responsibility. The life, character, and destiny of a human soul were entrusted to their care, and they must be wise, faithful, and efficient. They must be at once proud and humble at this their great opportunity. They must observe, learn, and practice. First and foremost in their eyes must always be this wonderful, important trust. Bertram laughed at first very heartily at Billy's instructions, which he declared were so bristling with capitals that he could fairly see them drop from her lips. Then, when he found how really very much in earnest she was, and how hurt she was at his levity, he managed to pull his face into something like sobriety while she talked to him, though he did persist in dropping kisses on her cheeks, her chin, her finger-tips, her hair, and the little pink lobes of her ears, just by way of punctuation to her sentences, he said. And he told her that he wasn't really slighting her lips, only that they moved so fast he could not catch them. Whereat Billy pouted, and told him severely that he was a bad, naughty boy, and that he did not deserve to be the father of the dearest, most wonderful baby in the world. "No, I know I don't," beamed Bertram with cheerful unrepentance, "but I am, just the same," he finished triumphantly, and this time he contrived to find his wife's lips. "Oh, Bertram," sighed Billy, despairingly, "you're an old dear, of course, and one just can't be cross with you, but you just don't realize your immense responsibility." "Oh, yes, I do," maintained Bertram, so seriously that even Billy herself almost believed him. In spite of his assertions, however, it must be confessed that Bertram was much more inclined to regard the new member of his family as just his son rather than as an important trust, and there is little doubt that he liked to toss him in the air and hear his gleeful crows of delight without any bother of observing him at all. As to the life and character and destiny entrusted to his care, it is to be feared that Bertram just plain gloried in his son, poked him in the ribs, and chucked him under the chin whenever he pleased, and gave never so much as a thought to character and destiny. It is to be feared, too, that he was proud without being humble, and that the only opportunity he really appreciated was the chance to show off his wife and baby to some less fortunate fellow man. But not so Billy. Billy joined a mothers' club, and entered a class in child training with an elaborate system of charts, rules, and tests. She subscribed to each new Mother's Helper and the like that she came across, devouring each and every one with an eagerness that was tempered only by a vague uneasiness at finding so many differences of opinion among those who knew. Undeniably Billy, if not Bertram, was indeed realizing the enormous responsibility and was keeping ever before her the important trust. In June, Bertram took a cottage at the South Shore, and by the time the really hot weather arrived, the family were well settled. It was only an hour away from Boston, and easy of access, but William said he guessed he would not go. He would stay in Boston, sleeping at the house and getting his meals at the club until the middle of July, when he was going down in Maine for his usual fishing trip, which he had planned to take a little earlier than usual this year. "But you'll be so lonesome, Uncle William," Billy demurred, "in this great house and all." "Oh, no, I shan't," rejoined Uncle William. "I shall only be sleeping here, you know," he finished with a slightly peculiar smile. It was well, perhaps, that Billy did not exactly realize the significance of that smile, nor the unconscious emphasis on the word sleeping, for it would have troubled her not a little. William, to tell the truth, was quite anticipating that sleeping. William's nights had not been exactly restful since the baby came. His evenings, too, had not been the peaceful things they were wont to be. Some of Billy's rules and tests were strenuously objected to on the part of her small son, and the young man did not hesitate to show it. Billy said that it was good for the baby to cry, that it developed his lungs, but William was very sure that it was not good for him. Certainly when the baby did cry, William could never help hovering near the center of disturbance, and he always had to remind Billy that it might be a pin, you know, or some cruel thing that was hurting, as if he, William, a great strong man, could sit calmly by and smoke a pipe, or lie in his comfortable bed and sleep, while that blessed little baby was crying his heart out like that. Of course, if one did not know he was crying, hence William's anticipation of those quiet, restful nights when he could not know it. Very soon after Billy's arrival at the cottage, Aunt Hannah and Alice Greggory came down for a day's visit. Aunt Hannah had been away from Boston for several weeks, so it was some time since she had seen the baby. "My, but hasn't he grown!" she exclaimed, picking the baby up and stooping to give him a snuggling kiss. The next instant she almost dropped the little fellow, so startling had been Billy's cry. "No, no, wait, Aunt Hannah, please," Billy was entreating, hurrying to the little corner cupboard. In a moment she was back with a small bottle and a bit of antiseptic cotton. "We always sterilize our lips now before we kiss him. It's so much safer, you know." Aunt Hannah sat down limply, the baby still in her arms. "Fiddle-dee-dee, Billy, what an absurd idea! What have you got in that bottle?" "Why, Aunt Hannah, it's just a little simple Listerine," bridled Billy. "And it isn't absurd at all. It's very sensible. My hygienic guide for mothers says—" "Well, I suppose I may kiss his hand," interposed Aunt Hannah, just a little curtly, "without subjecting myself to a city hospital treatment?" Billy laughed shamefacedly, but she still held her ground. "No, you can't, nor even his foot. He might get them in his mouth. Aunt Hannah, why does a baby think that everything, from his own toes to his father's watch fob and the plush balls on a caller's wrist bag, is made to eat? As if I could sterilize everything and keep him from getting hold of germs somewhere." "You'll have to have a germ-proof room for him," laughed Alice Greggory, playfully snapping her fingers at the baby in Aunt Hannah's lap. Billy turned eagerly. "Oh, did you read about that, too?" she cried. "I thought it was so interesting, and I wondered if I could do it." Alice stared frankly. "You don't mean to say they actually have such things?" she challenged. "Well, I read about them in a magazine," asserted Billy. "How you could have a germ-proof room. They said it was very simple, too. Just pasteurize the air, you know, by heating it to 110½ degrees Fahrenheit for 17½ minutes. I remember just the figures." "Simple indeed. It sounds so," scoffed Aunt Hannah with uplifted eyebrows. "Oh, well, I couldn't do it, of course," admitted Billy regretfully. "Bertram never'd stand for that in the world. He's always rushing in to show the baby off to every Tom, Dick, and Harry and his wife that comes, and of course if you open the nursery door that would let in those germ things, and you couldn't very well pasteurize your callers by heating them to 110½ degrees for 17½ minutes. I don't see how you could manage such a room anyway, unless you had a system of rooms like locks, same as they do for water in canals." "Oh, my grief and conscience! Locks, indeed!" almost groaned Aunt Hannah. "Here, Alice, will you please take this child? That is, if you have a germ-proof certificate about you to show to his mother. I want to take off my bonnet and gloves." "Take him? Of course I'll take him," laughed Alice. "And right under his mother's nose, too," she added, with a playful grimace at Billy. "And we'll make pat cakes, and send the little pigs to market, and have such a beautiful time that we'll forget there ever was such a thing in the world as an old germ. Eh, Babykins?" Babykins cooed his unqualified approval of this plan, but his mother looked troubled. "That's all right, Alice. You may play with him," she frowned doubtfully, "but you mustn't do it long, you know, not over 5 minutes." "5 minutes? Well, I like that, when I've come all the way from Boston purposely to see him," pouted Alice. "What's the matter now? Time for his nap?" "Oh, no, not for 13 minutes," replied Billy, consulting the watch at her belt. "But we never play with baby more than 5 minutes at a time. My Scientific Care of Infants says it isn't wise, that with some babies it's positively dangerous until after they're 6 months old. It makes them nervous and forces their mind, you know," she explained anxiously. "So, of course, we'd want to be careful. Bertram Jr. isn't quite 4 yet." "Why, yes, of course," murmured Alice politely, stopping a pat cake before it was half baked. The infant, as if suspecting that he was being deprived of his lawful baby rights, began to fret and whimper. "Poor itty thing!" crooned Aunt Hannah, who, having divested herself of bonnet and gloves, came hurriedly forward with outstretched hands. "Do they just booze 'em? Come here to your old Auntie Sweetums, and we'll go walkie. I saw a bow wow, such a tunin' icky wicky bow wow on the steps when I came in. Come, we go see icky wicky bow wow?" "Aunt Hannah, please," protested Billy, both hands upraised in horror. "Won't you say dog and leave out that dreadful icky wicky? Of course he can't understand things now, really, but we never know when he'll begin to, and we aren't ever going to let him hear baby talk at all if we can help it. And truly, when you come to think of it, it is absurd to expect a child to talk sensibly and rationally on the mental diet of moo-moos and choo-choos served out to them. Our professor of metaphysics and ideology in our child study course says that nothing is so receptive and plastic as the mind of a little child, and that it is perfectly appalling how we fill it with trivial absurdities that haven't even the virtue of being accurate. So that's why we're trying to be so careful with baby. You don't mind my speaking, I know, Aunt Hannah." "Oh, no, of course not, Billy," retorted Aunt Hannah, a little tartly, and with a touch of sarcasm most unlike her gentle self. "I'm sure I wouldn't wish to fill this infant's plastic mind with anything so appalling as trivial inaccuracies. May I be pardoned for suggesting, however," she went on, as the baby's whimper threatened to become a lusty wail, "that this young gentleman cries as if he were sleepy and hungry?" "Yes, he is," admitted Billy. "Well, doesn't your system of scientific training allow him to be given such trivial absurdities as food and naps?" inquired the lady mildly. "Of course it does, Aunt Hannah," retorted Billy, laughing in spite of herself, "and it's almost time now. There are only a few more minutes to wait." "Few more minutes to wait, indeed!" scorned Aunt Hannah. "I suppose the poor little fellow might cry and cry, and you wouldn't set that clock ahead by a teeny-weeny minute?" "Certainly not," said the young mother derisively. "My daily guide for mothers says that a time for everything, and everything in its time, is the very ABC and whole alphabet of right training. He does everything by the clock and to the minute," declared Billy proudly. Aunt Hannah sniffed, obviously skeptical and rebellious. Alice Greggory laughed. "Aunt Hannah looks as if she'd like to bring down her clock that strikes half an hour ahead," she said mischievously, but Aunt Hannah did not deign to answer this. "How long do you rock him?" she demanded of Billy. "I suppose I may do that, mayn't I?" "Mercy, I don't rock him at all, Aunt Hannah!" exclaimed Billy. "Nor sing to him?" "Certainly not." "But you did before I went away. I remember that you did." "Yes, I know I did," admitted Billy, "and I had an awful time, too. Some evenings every single one of us, even to Uncle William, had to try before we could get him off to sleep. But that was before I got my Efficiency of Mother and Child, or my Scientific Training, and oh, lots of others. You see, I didn't know a thing then, and I loved to rock him, so I did it, though the nurse said it wasn't good for him. But I didn't believe her. I've had an awful time changing, but I've done it. I just put him in his little crib, or his carriage, and after a while he goes to sleep. Sometimes now he doesn't cry hardly any. I'm afraid today, though, he will," she worried. "Yes, I'm afraid he will," almost screamed Aunt Hannah, in order to make herself heard above Bertram, Jr., who by this time was voicing his opinion of matters and things in no uncertain manner. It was not, after all, so very long before peace and order reigned, and in due course Bertram, Jr., in his carriage, lay fast asleep. Then, while Aunt Hannah went to Billy's room for a short rest, Billy and Alice went out to the wide veranda which faced the wonderful expanse of sky and sea. "Now tell me of yourself," commanded Billy almost at once. "It's been ages since I've heard or seen a thing of you." "There's nothing to tell." "Nonsense! But there must be," insisted Billy. "You know it's months since I've seen anything of you, hardly." "I know. We feel quite neglected at the Annex," said Alice. "But I don't go anywhere," defended Billy. "I can't. There isn't time." "Even to bring us the extra happiness?" smiled Alice. A quick change came to Billy's face. Her eyes glowed deeply. "No, though I've had so much that ought to have gone, such loads and loads of extra happiness which I couldn't possibly use myself. Sometimes I'm so happy, Alice, that I'm just frightened. It doesn't seem as if anybody ought to be so happy." "Oh, Billy, dear," demurred Alice, her eyes filling suddenly with tears. "Well, I've got the Annex. I'm glad I've got that for the overflow, anyway," resumed Billy, trying to steady her voice. "I've sent a whole lot of happiness up there mentally, if I haven't actually carried it, so I'm sure you must have got it. Now tell me of yourself." "There's nothing to tell," insisted Alice as before. "You're working as hard as ever?" "Yes, harder." "New pupils?" "Yes, and some concert engagements, good ones for next season. Accompaniments, you know." Billy nodded. "Yes, I've heard of you already twice lately in that line, and very flatteringly, too." "Have you? Well, that's good." There was a moment's silence, then abruptly Billy changed the subject. "I had a letter from Belle Calderwell yesterday." She paused expectantly, but there was no comment. "You don't seem interested," she frowned after a minute. Alice laughed. "Pardon me, but I don't know the lady, you see. Was it a good letter?" "You know her brother." "Very true." Alice's cheeks showed a deeper color. "Did she say anything of him?" "Yes, she said he was coming back to Boston next winter." "Indeed?" "Yes, she says that this time he declares he really is going to settle down to work," murmured Billy, demurely, with a sidelong glance at her companion. "She says he's engaged to be married, one of her friends over there." There was no reply. Alice appeared to be absorbed in watching a tiny white sail far out at sea. Again Billy was silent. Then, with studied carelessness, she said, "Yes, and you know Mr. Arkwright, too. She told of him." "Yes, well, what of him?" Alice's voice was studiedly indifferent. "Oh, there was quite a lot of him. Belle had just been to hear him sing, and then her brother had introduced him to her. She thinks he's perfectly wonderful in every way, I should judge. In fact, she simply raved over him. It seems that while we've been hearing nothing from him all winter, he's been winning no ends of laurels for himself in Paris and Berlin. He's been studying, too, of course, as well as singing, and now he's got a chance to sing somewhere, create a role or something. Belle said she wasn't quite clear on the matter herself, but it was a perfectly splendid chance, and one that was a fine feather in his cap." "Then he won't be coming home, that is, to Boston, at all this winter, probably?" said Alice with a cheerfulness that sounded just a little forced. "Not until February, but he is coming then. He's been engaged for 6 performances with the Boston Opera Company as a star tenor, mind you. Isn't that splendid?" "Indeed it is," murmured Alice. "Belle writes that Hugh says he's improved wonderfully, and that even he can see that his singing is marvelous. He says Paris is wild over him, but, for my part, I wish he'd come home and stay here where he belongs," finished Billy a bit petulantly. Why, Billy," murmured her friend, a curiously startled look coming into her eyes. "Well, I do," maintained Billy. Then recklessly she added, "I had such beautiful plans for him once, Alice. Oh, if you only could have cared for him, you'd have made such a splendid couple." A vivid scarlet flew to Alice's face. "Nonsense!" she cried, getting quickly to her feet and bending over one of the flower boxes along the veranda railing. "Mr. Arkwright never thought of marrying me, and I'm not going to marry anybody but my music." Billy sighed despairingly. "I know that's what you say now, but if—" She stopped abruptly. Around the turn of the veranda had appeared Aunt Hannah, wheeling Bertram, Jr., still asleep in his carriage. "I came out the other door," she explained softly, "and it was so lovely I just had to go in and get the baby. I thought it would be so nice for him to finish his nap out here." Billy arose with a troubled frown. "But, Aunt Hannah, he mustn't. He can't stay out here. I'm sorry, but we'll have to take him back." Aunt Hannah's eyes grew mutinous. "But I thought the outdoor air was just the thing for him. I'm sure your scientific hygienic nonsense says that." They did. That is, some of them do," acknowledged Billy worriedly. "But they differ so. And the one I'm going by now says that baby should always sleep in an even temperature, 70 degrees if possible. And that's exactly what the room in there was when I left him. It's not the same out here, I'm sure. In fact, I looked at the thermometer to see just before I came out myself. So, Aunt Hannah, I'm afraid I'll have to take him back." "But you used to have him sleep out of doors all the time, on that little balcony out of your room," argued Aunt Hannah, still plainly unconvinced. "Yes, I know I did. I was following the other man's rules then. As I said, if only they wouldn't differ so. Of course I want the best, but it's so hard to always know the best, and—" At this very inopportune moment Master Bertram took occasion to wake up, which brought even a deeper wrinkle of worry to his fond mother's forehead, for she said that, according to the clock, he should have been sleeping exactly 10½ more minutes, and that of course he couldn't commence the next thing until those 10½ minutes were up, or else his entire schedule for the day would be shattered. So what should she do with him for those should have been sleeping 10½ she did not know, all of which drew from Aunt Hannah the astounding exclamation of, "Oh, my grief and conscience, Billy, if you aren't the limit!" which indeed she must have been to have brought circumspect Aunt Hannah to the point of actually using slang. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 24. A Night Off. The Henshaw family did not return to the Strata until late in September. Billy said that the sea air seemed to agree so well with the baby it would be a pity to change until the weather became really too cool at the shore to be comfortable. William came back from his fishing trip in August, and resumed his old habit of sleeping at the house and taking his meals at the club. To be sure, for a week he went back and forth between the city and the beach house, but it happened to be at a time when Bertram, Jr., was cutting a tooth, and this so wore upon William's sympathy (William still could not help insisting it might be a pin) that he concluded peace lay only in flight, so he went back to the Strata. Bertram had stayed at the college all summer, painting industriously. Heretofore he had taken more of a vacation through the summer months, but this year there seemed to be nothing for him to do but paint. He did not like to go away on a trip and leave Billy, and she decided she could not take the baby nor leave him, and that she did not need any trip anyway. "All right, then, we'll just stay at the beach and have a fine vacation together," he had answered her. As Bertram saw it, however, he could detect very little vacation to it. Billy had no time for anything but the baby. When she was not actually engaged in caring for it, she was studying how to care for it. Never had she been sweeter or dearer, and never had Bertram loved her half so well. He was proud, too, of her devotion and of her triumphant success as a mother, but he did wish that sometimes, just once in a while, she would remember she was a wife and pay a little attention to him, her husband. Bertram was ashamed to own it even to himself, but he was feeling just a little abused that summer, and he knew that in his heart he was actually getting jealous of his own son, in spite of his adoration of the little fellow. He told himself defensively that it was not to be expected that he should not want the love of his wife, the attentions of his wife, and the companionship of his wife a part of the time. It was nothing more than natural that occasionally he should like to see her show some interest in subjects not mentioned in mothers' guides and scientific trainings of infants, and he did not believe he could be blamed for wanting his residence to be a home for himself as well as a nursery for his offspring. Even while he thus discontentedly argued with himself, however, Bertram called himself a selfish brute just to think such things when he had so dear and loving a wife as Billy, and so fine and splendid a baby as Bertram, Jr. He told himself, too, that very likely when they were back in their own house again, and when motherhood was not so new to her, Billy would not be so absorbed in the baby. She would return to her old interest in her husband, her music, her friends, and her own personal appearance. Meanwhile, there was always, of course, for him, his painting. So he would paint, accepting gladly what crumbs of attention fell from the baby's table, and trust the future to make Billy none the less a mother perhaps, but a little more the wife. Just how confidently he was counting on this coming change, Bertram hardly realized himself. But certainly the family was scarcely settled at the Strata before the husband gaily proposed one evening that he and Billy should go to the theater to see Romeo and Juliet. Billy was clearly both surprised and shocked. "Why, Bertram, I can't! You know I can't!" she exclaimed reprovingly. Bertram's heart sank, but he kept a brave front. "Why not?" "What a question! As if I'd leave Baby!" "But, Billy, dear, you'd be gone less than 3 hours, and you say Delia's the most careful of nurses." Billy's forehead puckered into an anxious frown. "I can't help it. Something might happen to him, Bertram. I couldn't be happy a minute." "But, dearest, aren't you ever going to leave him?" demanded the young husband forlornly. "Why, yes, of course, when it's reasonable and necessary. I went out to the Annex yesterday afternoon. I was gone almost 2 whole hours." "Well, did anything happen?" No, but then I telephoned, you see, several times, so I knew everything was all right." "Oh, well, if that's all you want, I could telephone, you know, between every act," suggested Bertram, with a sarcasm that was quite lost on the earnest young mother. "Yes, you could do that, couldn't you?" conceded Billy. "And of course I haven't been anywhere much lately." "Indeed I could," agreed Bertram, with a promptness that carefully hid his surprise at her literal acceptance of what he had proposed as a huge joke. "Come, is it a go? Shall I telephone to see if I can get seats?" "You think Baby'll surely be all right?" "I certainly do." "And you'll telephone home between every act?" "I will." Bertram's voice sounded almost as if he were repeating the marriage service. "And we'll come straight home afterwards as fast as Johnny and Peggy can bring us?" "Certainly." "Then I think I'll go," breathed Billy tremulously, plainly showing what a momentous concession she thought she was making. "I do love Romeo and Juliet, and I haven't seen it for ages." "Good! Then I'll find out about the tickets," cried Bertram, so elated at the prospect of having an old-time evening out with his wife that even the half-hourly telephones did not seem too great a price to pay. When the time came, they were a little late in starting. Baby was fretful, and though Billy usually laid him in his crib and unhesitatingly left the room, insisting that he should go to sleep by himself in accordance with the most approved rules in her scientific training, yet tonight she could not bring herself to the point of leaving the house until he was quiet. Hurried as they were when they did start, Billy was conscious of Bertram's frowning disapproval of her frock. "You don't like it, of course, dear, and I don't blame you," she smiled remorsefully. "Oh, I like it. That is, I did when it was new," rejoined her husband, with apologetic frankness. "But, dear, didn't you have anything else? This looks almost, well, mussy, you know." "No. Well, yes, maybe there were others," admitted Billy. "But this was the quickest and easiest to get into, and it all came just as I was getting Baby ready for bed, you know. I am a fright, though, I'll acknowledge, as far as clothes go. I haven't had time to get a thing since Baby came. I must get something right away, I suppose." "Yes, indeed," declared Bertram with emphasis, hurrying his wife into the waiting automobile. Billy had to apologize again at the theater, for the curtain had already risen on the ancient quarrel between the houses of Capulet and Montague, and Billy knew her husband's special abhorrence of tardy arrivals. Later, though, when well established in their seats, Billy's mind was plainly not with the players on the stage. "Do you suppose Baby is all right?" she whispered after a time. "Shh! Of course he is, dear." There was a brief silence, during which Billy peered at her program in the semi-darkness. Then she nudged her husband's arm ecstatically. "Bertram, I couldn't have chosen a better play if I'd tried. There are 5 acts. I'd forgotten there were so many. That means you can telephone 4 times. Yes, dear. Bertram's voice was sternly cheerful. You must be sure they tell you exactly how Baby is. All right, dear. Shh, here's Romeo. Billy subsided. She even clapped a little in spasmodic enthusiasm. Presently she peered at her program again. There wouldn't be time, I suppose, to telephone between the scenes, she hazarded wistfully. There are 16 of those. Well, hardly, Billy. You aren't paying one bit of attention to the play. Why, of course I am, whispered Billy indignantly. I think it's perfectly lovely, and I'm perfectly contented, too, since I found out about those 5 acts. And as long as I can't have the 16 scenes, she added, settling back in her seat. As if to prove that she was interested in the play, her next whisper, some time later, had to do with one of the characters on the stage. Who's that? The nurse? Mercy, we wouldn't want her for Baby, would we? In spite of himself, Bertram chuckled this time. Billy, too, laughed at herself. Then, resolutely, she settled into her seat again. The curtain was not fairly down on the first act before Billy had laid an urgent hand on her husband's arm. Now remember, ask if he's waked up or anything, she directed, and be sure to say I'll come right home if they need me. Now hurry. Yes, dear. Bertram rose with alacrity. I'll be back right away. Oh, but I don't want you to hurry too much, she called after him softly. I want you to take plenty of time to ask questions. All right, nodded Bertram with a quizzical smile as he turned away. Obediently, Bertram asked all the questions he could think of, then came back to his wife. There was nothing in his report that even Billy could disapprove of or worry about, and with almost a contented look on her face, she turned toward the stage as the curtain went up on the second act. I love this balcony scene, she sighed happily. Romeo, however, had not half finished his impassioned love-making when Billy clutched her husband's arm almost fiercely. Bertram, she fairly hissed in a tragic whisper, I've just happened to think. Won't it be awful when Baby falls in love? I know I shall just hate that girl for taking him away from me. Shh, Billy, expostulated her husband, choking with half-stifled laughter. That woman in front heard you. I know she did. Well, I shall, sighed Billy mournfully, turning back to the stage. Good night, good night. Parting is such sweet sorrow that I shall say good night till it be morrow, sighed Juliet passionately to her Romeo. Mercy, I hope not, whispered Billy flippantly in Bertram's ear. I'm sure I don't want to stay here till tomorrow. I want to go home and see Baby. Billy, pleaded Bertram so despairingly that Billy, really conscience-smitten, sat back in her seat and remained, for the rest of the act, very quiet indeed. Deceived by her apparent tranquillity, Bertram turned as the curtain went down. Now, Billy, surely you don't think it'll be necessary to telephone so soon as this again, he ventured. Billy's countenance fell. But, Bertram, you said you would. Of course, if you aren't willing to, but I've been counting on hearing all through this hard, long act, and... Goodness me, Billy, I'll telephone every minute for you, of course, if you want me to, cried Bertram, springing to his feet and trying not to show his impatience. He was back more promptly this time. Everything O.K., he smiled reassuringly into Billy's anxious eyes. Delia said she'd just been up and the little chap was sound asleep. To the man's unbounded surprise, his wife grew actually white. Up, she exclaimed. Do you mean that Delia went downstairs to stay and left my baby up there alone? But, Billy, she said he was all right, murmured Bertram softly, casting uneasy sidelong glances at his 2 interested neighbors. All right, perhaps he was then, but he may not be later. Delia should stay in the next room all the time, where she could hear the least thing. Yes, dear, she will, I'm sure, if you tell her to, soothed Bertram quickly. It'll be all right next time. Billy shook her head. She was obviously near to crying. But, Bertram, I can't stand it to sit here enjoying myself all safe and comfortable and know that Baby is alone up there in that great big room. Please, please, won't you go and telephone Delia to go up now and stay there?" Bertram, weary, sorely tried, and increasingly aware of those annoyingly interested neighbors, was on the point of saying a very decided no, but a glance into Billy's pleading eyes settled it. Without a word he went back to the telephone. The curtain was up when he slipped into his seat, very red of face. In answer to Billy's hurried whisper he shook his head. But in the short pause between the first and second scenes he said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, Billy, but I couldn't get the house at all." "Couldn't get them? But you'd just been talking with them." "That's it, probably. I had just telephoned, so they weren't watching for the bell. Anyhow, I couldn't get them." "Then you didn't get Delia at all?" "Of course not. And Baby is still all alone?" "But he's all right, dear. Delia's keeping watch of him." For a moment there was silence. Then with clear decisiveness came Billy's voice. "Bertram, I am going home." "Billy, I am." "Billy, for heaven's sake, don't be a silly goose. The play's half over already. We'll soon be going anyway." Billy's lips came together in a thin little determined line. "Bertram, I am going home now, please," she said. "You needn't come with me. I can go alone." Bertram said 2 words under his breath which it was just as well, perhaps, that Billy and the neighbors did not hear. Then he gathered up their wraps and, with Billy, stalked out of the theater. At home everything was found to be absolutely as it should be. Bertram Jr. was peacefully sleeping, and Delia, who had come up from downstairs, was sewing in the next room. "There, you see," observed Bertram a little sourly. Billy drew a long, contented sigh. "Yes, I see. Everything is all right. But that's exactly what I wanted to do, Bertram, you know, to see for myself," she finished happily. And Bertram, looking at her rapt face as she hovered over the baby's crib, called himself a brute and a beast to mind anything that could make Billy look like that. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 25. Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot? Bertram did not ask Billy very soon again to go to the theater. For some days, indeed, he did not ask her to do anything. Then one evening he did beg for some music. "Billy, you haven't played to me or sung to me since I could remember," he complained. "I want some music." Billy gave a merry laugh and wriggled her fingers experimentally. "Mercy, Bertram, I don't believe I could play a note. You know I'm all out of practice." "But why don't you practice?" "Why, Bertram, I can't. In the first place, I don't seem to have any time except when Baby's asleep, and I can't play then. I'd wake him up." Bertram sighed irritably, rose to his feet, and began to walk up and down the room. He came to a pause at last, his eyes bent a trifle disapprovingly on his wife. "Billy, dear, don't you wear anything but those wrapper things nowadays?" he asked plaintively. Again Billy laughed, but this time a troubled frown followed the laugh. "I know, Bertram, I suppose they do look dowdy sometimes," she confessed. "But you see, I hate to wear a really good dress. Baby rumples them up so, and I'm usually in a hurry to get him mornings, and these are so easy to slip into, and so much more comfortable for me to handle him in." "Yes, of course, I see," mumbled Bertram, listlessly taking up his walk again. Billy, after a moment's silence, began to talk animatedly. Baby had done a wonderfully cunning thing that morning, and Billy had not had a chance yet to tell Bertram. Baby was growing more and more cunning anyway these days, and there were several things she believed she had not told him, so she told them now. Bertram listened politely, interestedly. He told himself that he was interested, too. Of course he was interested in the doings of his own child, but he still walked up and down the room a little restlessly, coming to a halt at last by the window across which the shade had not been drawn. "Billy," he cried suddenly, with his old boyish earnestness, there's a glorious moon. Come on, let's take a little walk. A real fellow and his best girl walk, will you?" "Mercy, dear, I couldn't," cried Billy, springing to her feet. "I'd love to, though, if I could," she added hastily, as she saw disappointment cloud her husband's face. "But I told Delia she might go out. It isn't her regular evening, of course, but I told her I didn't mind staying with baby a bit, so I'll have to go right up now. She'll be going soon. But, dear, you go and take your walk. It'll do you good. Then you can come back and tell me all about it. Only you must come in quietly so as not to wake the baby," she finished, giving her husband an affectionate kiss as she left the room. After a disconsolate 5 minutes of solitude, Bertram got his hat and coat and went out for his walk, but he told himself he did not expect to enjoy it. Bertram Henshaw knew that the old rebellious jealousy of the summer had him fast in its grip. He was heartily ashamed of himself, but he could not help it. He wanted Billy, and he wanted her then. He wanted to talk to her. He wanted to tell her about a new portrait commission he had just obtained, and he wanted to ask her what she thought of the idea of a brand-new Face of a Girl for the Bohemian Tin exhibition next March. He wanted—but then what would be the use? She would listen, of course, but he would know by the very looks of her face that she would not be really thinking of what he was saying, and he would be willing to wager his best canvas that in the very first pause she would tell about the baby's newest tooth or latest toy. Not but that he liked to hear about the little fellow, of course, and not but that he was proud as punch of him, too, but that he would like sometimes to hear Billy talk of something else. The sweetest melody in the world, if dinned into one's ears day and night, became something to be fled from. And Billy ought to talk of something else, too. Bertram, Jr., wonderful as he was, really was not the only thing in the world, or even the only baby, and other people, outsiders, their friends, had a right to expect that sometimes other matters might be considered, their own, for instance. But Billy seemed to have forgotten this. No matter whether the subject of conversation had to do with the latest novel or a trip to Europe, under Billy's guidance it invariably led straight to Baby's Jack and Jill book, or to a perambulator journey in the public garden. If it had not been so serious, it would have been really funny the way all roads led straight to one goal. He himself, when alone with Billy, had started the most unusual and foreign subjects, sometimes just to see if there were not somewhere a little bypath that did not bring up in his own nursery. He never, however, found one. But it was not funny. It was serious. Was this glorious gift of parenthood, to which he had looked forward as the crowning joy of his existence, to be nothing but a tragedy that would finally wreck his domestic happiness? It could not be. It must not be. He must be patient and wait. Billy loved him. He was sure she did. By and by, this obsession of motherhood, which had her so fast in its grip, would relax. She would remember that her husband had rights as well as her child. Once again she would give him the companionship, love, and sympathetic interest so dear to him. Meanwhile there was his work. He must bury himself in that. And fortunate indeed he was, he told himself, that he had something so absorbing. It was at this point in his meditations that Bertram rounded a corner and came face to face with a man who stopped him short with a jovial, "Isn't it? By George, it is Bertie Henshaw. Well, what do you think of that for luck? And me only 2 days home from gay Paris." "Oh, Seaver, how are you? You are a stranger." Bertram's voice and handshake were a bit more cordial than they would have been had he not at the moment been feeling so abused and forlorn. In the old days he had liked this Bob Seaver well. Seaver was an artist like himself, and was good company always. But Seaver and his crowd were a little too bohemian for William's taste, and after Billy came she too had objected to what she called that horrid Seaver man. In his heart Bertram knew that there was good foundation for their objections, so he had avoided Seaver for a time, and for some years now the man had been abroad, somewhat to Bertram's relief. To-night, however, Seaver's genial smile and hearty friendliness were like a sudden burst of sunshine on a rainy day, and Bertram detested rainy days. He was feeling now, too, as if he had just met a whole week of them. "Yes, I am something of a stranger here," nodded Seaver, "but I tell you what, little old Boston looks mighty good to me all the same. Come on, you're just the fellow we want. I'm on my way now to the old stamping ground. Come right about face, old chap, and come with me." Bertram shook his head. "Sorry, but I guess I can't tonight," he sighed. Both gesture and words were unhesitating, but the voice carried the discontent of a small boy who, while the sun is still shining, has been told to come into the house. "Oh, rats! Yes, you can, too. Come on. Lots of the old crowd will be there. Griggs, Beebe, Jack Jenkins, and Tully. We need you to complete the show." "Jack Jenkins? Is he here?" A new eagerness had come into Bertram's voice. "Sure. He came on from New York last night. Great boy, Jenkins. Just back from Paris, fairly covered with medals, you know." "Yes, so I hear. I haven't seen him for 4 years. Better come tonight, then." "No," began Bertram, with obvious reluctance. "It's already 9 o'clock, and—" "9 o'clock!" cut in Seaver with a broad grin. "Since when has your limit been 9 o'clock? I've seen the time when you didn't mind 9 o'clock in the morning, Bertie. What's got— Oh, I remember. I met another friend of yours in Berlin, chap named Arkwright. And say, he's some singer, you bet. You're going to hear of him one of these days. Well, he told me all about how you'd settled down now, son and heir, fireside bliss, pretty wife, and all the fixin's. But I say, Bertie, doesn't she let you out any?" "Nonsense, Seaver!" flared Bertram in annoyed wrath. "Well, then, why don't you come tonight? If you want to see Jenkins, you'll have to. He's going back to New York tomorrow." For only a brief minute longer did Bertram hesitate. Then he turned squarely about with an air of finality. "Is he? Well, then, perhaps I will," he said. "I'd hate to miss Jenkins entirely." "Good!" exclaimed his companion, as they fell into step. "Have a cigar?" "Thanks. Don't mind if I do." If Bertram's chin was a little higher, and his step a little more decided than usual, it was all merely by way of accompaniment to his thoughts. Certainly it was right that he should go, and it was sensible. Indeed, it was really almost imperative, due to Billy, as it were, after that disagreeable taunt of Seaver's, as if she did not want him to go when and where he pleased. As if she would consent for a moment to figure in the eyes of his friends as a tyrannical wife who objected to her husband's passing a social evening with his friends. To be sure, in this particular case she might not favor Seaver's presence, but even she would not mind this once. And anyhow, it was Jenkins that was the attraction, not Seaver. Besides, he himself was no undeveloped boy now. He was a man, presumably able to care for himself. Besides, again, had not Billy herself told him to go out and enjoy the evening without her, as she had to stay with the baby? He would telephone her, of course, that he had met some old friends and that he might be late. Then she would not worry. And forthwith, having settled the matter in his mind, and to his complete satisfaction, Bertram gave his undivided attention to Seaver, who had already plunged into an account of a recent art exhibition he had attended in Paris. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 26. Ghosts that Walked for Bertram. October proved to be unusually mild, and about the middle of the month, Bertram, after much unselfish urging on the part of Billy, went to a friend's camp in the Adirondacks for a week's stay. He came back with an angry, lugubrious face and a broken arm. "Oh, Bertram, and your right one, too, the same one you broke before," mourned Billy tearfully. "Of course," retorted Bertram, trying in vain to give an air of jauntiness to his reply. "Didn't want to be too changeable, you know." "But how did you do it, dear?" fell into a silly little hole covered with underbrush. But, oh, Billy, what's the use? I did it, and I can't undo it. More's the pity." "Of course you can't, you poor boy," sympathized Billy, "and you shan't be tormented with questions. We'll just be thankful 'twas no worse. You can't paint for a while, of course, but we won't mind that. It'll just give Baby and me a chance to have you all to ourselves for a time, and we'll love that." "Yes, of course," sighed Bertram, so abstractedly that Billy bridled with pretty resentment. "Well, I like your enthusiasm, sir," she frowned. "I'm afraid you don't appreciate the blessings you do have, young man. Do you realize what I said? I remarked that you could be with Baby and me," she emphasized. Bertram laughed and gave his wife an affectionate kiss. "Indeed, I do appreciate my blessings, dear, when those blessings are such treasures as you and Baby, but—" Only his doleful eyes, fixed on his injured arm, finished his sentence. "I know, dear, of course, and I understand," murmured Billy, all tenderness at once. They were not easy for Bertram, those following days. Once again he was obliged to accept the little intimate personal services that he so disliked. Once again he could do nothing but read, or wander disconsolately into his studio and gaze at his half-finished Face of a Girl. Occasionally, it is true, driven nearly to desperation by the haunting vision in his mind's eye, he picked up a brush and attempted to make his left hand serve his will, but a bare half-dozen irritating, ineffectual strokes were usually enough to make him throw down his brush in disgust. He never could do anything with his left hand, he told himself dejectedly. Many of his hours, of course, he spent with Billy and his son, and they were happy hours, too, but they always came to be restless ones before the day was half over. Billy was always devotion itself to him when she was not attending to the baby. He had no fault to find with Billy, and the baby was delightful. He could find no fault with the baby. But the baby was fretful. He was teething, Billy said, and he needed a great deal of attention, so naturally Bertram drifted out of the nursery after a time and went down into his studio, where were his dear empty palette, his orderly brushes, and his tantalizing Face of a Girl. From the studio, generally, Bertram went out onto the street. Sometimes he dropped into a fellow artist's studio, sometimes he strolled into a club or cafe where he knew he would be likely to find some friends who would help him while away a tiresome hour. Bertram's friends quite vied with each other in rendering this sort of aid, so much so, indeed, that, naturally perhaps, Bertram came to call on their services more and more frequently. Particularly was this the case when, after the splints were removed, Bertram found, as the days passed, that his arm was not improving as it should improve. This not only disappointed and annoyed him, but worried him. He remembered sultry, disquieting warnings given by the physician at the time of the former break, warnings concerning the probable seriousness of a repetition of the injury. To Billy, of course, Bertram said nothing of all this, but just before Christmas he went to see a noted specialist. An hour later, almost in front of the learned surgeon's door, Bertram met Bob Seaver. "Great Scott, Bertie, what's up?" ejaculated Seaver. "You look as if you'd seen a ghost." "I have," answered Bertram with grim bitterness. "I've seen the ghost of every Face of a Girl I ever painted." "Gorry! So bad as that? No wonder you look as if you'd been disporting in graveyards," chuckled Seaver, laughing at his own joke. "What's the matter? Arm on a rampage today?" He paused for a reply, but as Bertram did not answer at once, he resumed, with gay insistence, "Come on, you need cheering up. Suppose we go down to Trentini's and see who's there." "All right," agreed Bertram dully. "Suit yourself." Bertram was not thinking of Seaver, Trentini's, or whom he might find there. Bertram was thinking of certain words he had heard less than half an hour ago. He was wondering, too, if ever again he could think of anything but those words. "The truth?" the great surgeon had said. "Well, the truth is, I'm sorry to tell you the truth, Mr. Henshaw, but if you will have it, you've painted the last picture you'll ever paint with your right hand, I fear. It's a bad case. This break, coming as it did on top of the serious injury of 2 or 3 years ago, was bad enough, but to make matters worse, The bone was imperfectly set and wrongly treated, which could not be helped, of course, as you were miles away from skilled surgeons at the time of the injury. We'll do the best we can, of course, but, well, you asked for the truth, you remember, so I had to give it to you. End of chapter 26. Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 27 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 27. The Mother, the Wife. Bertram made up his mind at once that, for the present at least, he would tell no one what the surgeon had said to him. He had placed himself under the man's care, and there was nothing to do but to take the prescribed treatment and await results as patiently as he could. Meanwhile, there was no need to worry Billy or William or anybody else with the matter. Billy was so busy with her holiday plans that she was only vaguely aware of what seemed to be an increase of restlessness on the part of her husband during those days just before Christmas. "Poor dear, is the arm feeling hard today?" she asked one morning, when the gloom on her husband's face was deeper than usual. Bertram frowned and did not answer directly. "Lots of good I am these days," he exclaimed, his moody eyes on the armful of many-shaped, many-sized packages she carried. "What are those for, the tree?" "Yes, it's going to be so pretty, Bertram," exulted Billy. "And do you know, Baby positively acts as if he suspected things, little as he is," she went on eagerly. "He's as nervous as a witch. I can't keep him still a minute." "How about his mother?" hinted Bertram with a faint smile. Billy laughed. "Well, I'm afraid she isn't exactly calm herself," she confessed, as she hurried out the room with her parcels. Bertram looked after her longingly, despondently. "I wonder what she'd say if she knew," he muttered. "But she shan't know, till she just has to," he vowed suddenly under his breath, striding into the hall for his hat and coat. Never had the Strata known such a Christmas as this was planned to be. Cyril, Marie, and the twins were to be there, also Kate, her husband, and 3 children, Paul, Egbert, and little Kate from the West. On Christmas Day there was to be a big family dinner with Aunt Hannah down from the Annex. Then, in concession to the extreme youth of the young host and his twin cousins, there was to be an afternoon tree. The shades were to be drawn and the candles lighted, however, so that there might be no loss of effect. In the evening the tree was to be once more loaded with fascinating packages and candy bags, and this time the Gregorys, Tommy Dunn, and all the rest from the Annex were to have the fun all over again. From garret to basement the Strata was aflame with holly and aglitter with tinsel. Nowhere did there seem to be a spot that did not have its bit of tissue paper or its trail of red ribbon, and everything, holly, ribbon, tissue, and tinsel, led to the mysteriously closed doors of the great front drawing-room, past which none but Billy and her accredited messengers might venture. No wonder, indeed, that even Baby scented excitement, and that Baby's mother was not exactly calm. No wonder, too, that Bertram, with his helpless right arm and his heavy heart, felt peculiarly forlorn and out of it. No wonder, also, that he took himself literally out of it with growing frequency. Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell and little Kate were to stay at the Strata. The boys, Paul and Egbert, were to go to Cyril's. Promptly at the appointed time, 2 days before Christmas, they arrived, and from that hour until 2 days after Christmas, when the last bit of holly, ribbon, tissue, and tinsel disappeared from the floor, Billy moved in a whirl of anxious responsibility that was yet filled with fun, frolic, and laughter. It was a great success, the whole affair. Everybody seemed pleased and happy, that is, everybody but Bertram, and he very plainly tried to seem pleased and happy. Even Cyril unbent to the extent of not appearing to mind the noise one bit, and Sister Kate, Bertram said, found only the extraordinary small number of 4 details to change in the arrangements. Baby obligingly let his teeth-getting go for the occasion, and he and the twins, Franz and Felix, were the admiration and delight of all. Little Kate, to be sure, was a trifle disconcerting once or twice, but everybody was too absorbed to pay much attention to her. Billy did, however, remember her opening remarks. "Well, little Kate, do you remember me?" Billy had greeted her pleasantly. "Oh, yes," little Kate had answered with a winning smile. "You're my Aunt Billy, what married my Uncle Bertram instead of Uncle William, as you said you would first." Everybody laughed, and Billy colored, of course. But little Kate went on eagerly. "And I've been wanting just awfully to see you," she announced. "Have you? I'm glad, I'm sure. I feel highly flattered," smiled Billy. "Well, I have. You see, I wanted to ask you something. Have you ever wished that you had married Uncle William instead of Uncle Bertram? Or that you'd tried for Uncle Cyril before Auntie Marie got him?" "Kate!" gasped her horrified mother. "I told you. You see," she broke off, turning to Billy despairingly, "she's been pestering me with questions like that ever since she knew she was coming. She never has forgotten the way you changed from one uncle to the other. You may remember it made a great impression on her at the time." "Yes, I remember," stammered Billy, trying to laugh off her embarrassment. "But you haven't told me yet whether you did wish you'd married Uncle William or Uncle Cyril," interposed little Kate persistently. "No, no, of course not!" exclaimed Billy with a vivid blush, casting her eyes about for a door of escape, and rejoicing greatly when she spied Delia with the baby coming toward them. "There, look, my dear, here's your new cousin, little Bertram," she exclaimed. "Don't you want to see him?" Little Kate turned dutifully. "Yes'm, Aunt Billy, but I'd rather see the twins. Mother says they're real pretty and cunning." Yes, they are," murmured Billy, on whom the emphasis of the "there" had not been lost. Naturally, as may be supposed, therefore, Billy had not forgotten little Kate's opening remarks. Immediately after Christmas, Mr. Hartwell and the boys went back to their Western home, leaving Mrs. Hartwell and her daughter to make a round of visits to friends in the East. For almost a week after Christmas they remained at the Strata, and it was on the last day of their stay that little Kate asked the question that proved so momentous in results. Billy, almost unconsciously, had avoided tete-a-tetes with her small guest, but today they were alone together. "Aunt Billy," began the little girl, after a meditative gaze into the other's face, "you are married to Uncle Bertram, aren't you?" "I certainly am, my dear," smiled Billy, trying to speak unconcernedly. "Well, then, what makes you forget it?" "What makes me forget? Why, child, what a question! What do you mean? I don't forget it!" exclaimed Billy indignantly. "Then what did Mother mean? I heard her tell Uncle William myself she didn't know I heard, though that she did wish you'd remember you were Uncle Bertram's wife as well as Cousin Bertram's mother." Billy flushed scarlet, then grew very white. At that moment Mrs. Hartwell came into the room. Little Kate turned triumphantly. "There, she hasn't forgotten, and I knew she hadn't, Mother. I asked her just now, and she said she hadn't." "Hadn't what?" questioned Mrs. Hartwell, looking a little apprehensively at her sister-in-law's white face and angry eyes. "Hadn't forgotten that she was Uncle Bertram's wife?" "Kate," interposed Billy, steadily meeting her sister-in-law's gaze, "will you be good enough to tell me what this child is talking about?" Mrs. Hartwell sighed and gave an impatient gesture. "Kate, I've a mind to take you home on the next train," she said to her daughter. "Run away now, downstairs. Your Aunt Billy and I want to talk. Come, come, hurry. I mean what I say," she added warningly, as she saw unmistakable signs of rebellion on the small young face. "I wish," pouted little Kate, rising reluctantly and moving toward the door, "that you didn't always send me away just when I wanted most to stay." "Well, Kate?" prompted Billy as the door closed behind the little girl. "Yes, I suppose I'll have to say it now as long as that child has put her finger in the pie. But I hadn't intended to speak, no matter what I saw. I promised myself I wouldn't before I came. I know, of course, how Bertram and Cyril and William, too, say that I'm always interfering in affairs that don't concern me, though for that matter, if my own brother's affairs don't concern me, I don't know who should. But, as I said, I wasn't going to speak this time, no matter what I saw. And I haven't, except to William and Cyril and Aunt Hannah. But I suppose somewhere little Kate got hold of it. It's simply this, Billy. It seems to me high time you begin to realize that you're Bertram's wife as well as the baby's mother. That I am— I don't think I quite understand, said Billy unsteadily. No, I suppose you don't, sighed Kate. Though where your eyes are, I don't see, or rather I do see. You're on the baby always. It's all very well and lovely, Billy, to be a devoted mother, and you certainly are that. I'll say that much for you, and I'll admit I never thought you would be. But can't you see what you're doing to Bertram? Doing to Bertram by being a devoted mother to his son? Yes, doing to Bertram. Can't you see what a change there is in the boy? He doesn't act like himself at all. He's restless and gloomy and entirely out of sorts. Yes, I know, but that's his arm, pleaded Billy. Poor boy, he's so tired of it. Kate shook her head decisively. It's more than his arm, Billy. You'd see it yourself if you weren't blinded by your absorption in that baby. Where is Bertram every evening? Where is he daytimes? Do you realize that he's been at home scarcely one evening since I came? And as for the days, he's almost never here. But, Kate, he can't paint now, you know, so of course he doesn't need to stay so closely at home, defended Billy. He goes out to find distraction from himself. Yes, distraction, indeed, sniffed Kate. And where do you suppose he finds it? Do you know where he finds it? I tell you, Billy, Bertram Henshaw is not the sort of man that should find too much distraction outside his home. His tastes and his temperament are altogether too bohemian, and— Billy interrupted with a peremptory upraised hand. Please remember, Kate, you are speaking of my husband to his wife, and his wife has perfect confidence in him, and is just a little particular as to what you say. Yes, well, I'm speaking of my brother, too, whom I know very well, shrugged Kate. All is, you may remember sometime that I warn you, that's all. This trusting business is all very pretty, and I think 'twould be a lot prettier and a vast deal more sensible if you'd give him a little attention as well as trust, and see if you can't keep him at home a bit more. At least you'll know whom he's with then. Cyril says he saw him last week with Bob Seaver. With Bob Seaver? Faltered Billy, changing color. Yes, I see you remember him, smiled Kate, not quite agreeably. Perhaps now you'll take some stock in what I've said and remember it. I'll remember it, certainly, retorted Billy, a little proudly. You've said a good many things to me in the past, Mrs. Hartwell, and I remember them all, every one. It was Kate's turn to flush, and she did it. Yes, I know, and I presume very likely sometimes there hasn't been much foundation for what I've said. I think this time, however, you'll find there is, she finished, with an air of hurt dignity. Billy made no reply, perhaps because Delia at that moment brought in the baby. Mrs. Hartwell and little Kate left the Strata the next morning. Until then Billy contrived to keep, before them, a countenance serene and a manner free from unrest. Even when, after dinner that evening, Bertram put on his hat and coat and went out, Billy refused to meet her sister-in-law's meaning gaze. But in the morning, after they had left the house, Billy did not attempt to deceive herself. Determinedly then she set herself to going over in her mind the past months since the baby came, and she was appalled at what she found. Ever in her ears, too, was that feared name, Bob Seaver, and ever before her eyes was that night years ago, when, as an 18-year-old girl, she had followed Bertram and Bob Seaver into a glittering cafe at 11 o'clock at night because Bertram had been drinking and was not himself. She remembered Bertram's face when he had seen her, and what he had said when she begged him to come home. She remembered, too, what the family had said afterward, but she remembered also that years later Bertram had told her what that escapade of hers had really done for him, and that he believed he had actually loved her from that moment. After that night, at all events, he had had little to do with Bob Seaver. And now Seaver was back again, it seemed, and with Bertram. They had been seen together, and if they had, what could she do? Surely she could hardly now follow them into a public cafe and demand that Seaver let her husband come home. But she could keep him at home, perhaps. Billy quite brightened at this thought. Kate had said that she was so absorbed in Baby that her husband received no attention at all. Billy did not believe this was true, but if it were true, she could at least rectify that mistake. If it were attention that he wanted, he should want no more. Poor Bertram! No wonder that he had sought distraction outside, when one had a horrid broken arm that would not let one do anything. What else could one do? Just here, Billy suddenly remembered the book, A Talk to Young Wives. If she recollected rightly, there was a chapter that covered the very claim Kate had been making. Billy had not thought of the book for months, but she went at once to get it now. There might be, after all, something in it that would help her. The Coming of the First Baby. Billy found the chapter without difficulty and settled herself to read, her countenance alight with interest. In a surprisingly short time, however, a new expression came to her face, and at last a little gasp of dismay fell from her lips. She looked up then with a startled gaze. Had her walls possessed eyes and ears all these past months, only to give instructions to an unseen hand that it might write what the eyes and ears had learned? For it was such sentences as these that the conscience-smitten Billy read. Maternity is apt to work a miracle in a woman's life, but sometimes it spells disaster so far as domestic bliss is concerned. The young mother, wrapped up in the delights and duties of motherhood, utterly forgets that she has a husband. She lives and moves and has her being in the nursery. She thinks baby, talks baby, knows only baby. She refuses to dress up because it is easier to take care of baby in a frowsy wrapper. She will not go out with her husband for fear something might happen to the baby. She gives up her music because baby won't let her practice. In vain her husband tries to interest her in his own affairs. She has neither eyes nor ears for him, only for baby. Now, no man enjoys having his nose put out of joint, even by his own child. He loves his child devotedly and is proud of him, of course, but that does not keep him from wanting the society of his wife occasionally, nor from longing for her old-time love and sympathetic interest. It is an admirable thing, certainly, for a woman to be a devoted mother, but maternal affection can be carried too far. Husbands have some rights as well as offspring, and the wife who neglects her husband for her babies does so at her peril. Home with the wife eternally in the nursery is apt to be a dull and lonely thing to the average husband, so he starts out to find amusement for himself, and he finds it. Then is the time when the new little life that is so precious and that should have bound the two more closely together becomes the wedge that drives them apart. Billy did not read any more. With a little sobbing cry she flung the book back into her desk and began to pull off her wrapper. Her fingers shook. Already she saw herself a monster, a wicked destroyer of domestic bliss, with her thoughtless absorption in baby, until he had become that awful thing, a wedge. And Bertram, poor Bertram, with his broken arm. She had not played to him, nor sung to him, nor gone out with him. And when had they had one of their good long talks about Bertram's work and plans? But it should all be changed now. She would play and sing and go out with him. She would dress up, too. He would see no more wrappers. She would ask about his work and seem interested. She was interested. She remembered now that just before he was hurt, he had told her of a new portrait and of a new Face of a Girl that he had planned to do. Lately he had said nothing about these. He had seemed discouraged, and no wonder with his broken arm. But she would change all that, he would see, and forthwith Billy hurried to her closet to pick out her prettiest house frock. Long before dinner Billy was ready, waiting in the dining-room. She had on a pretty little blue silk gown that she knew Bertram liked, and she watched very anxiously for Bertram to come up the steps. She remembered now with a pang that he had long since given up his peculiar ring, but she meant to meet him at the door just the same. Bertram, however, did not come. At 6:15 he telephoned that he had met some friends and would dine at the club. "My, how pretty we are!" exclaimed Uncle William when he came down to dinner together. "New frock?" "Why, no, Uncle William," laughed Billy, a little tremulously. "You've seen it dozens of times." "Have I?" murmured the man. "I don't seem to remember it." "Too bad Bertram isn't here to see you. Somehow you look unusually pretty tonight." And Billy's heart ached anew. Billy spent the evening practicing, softly to be sure, so as not to wake baby, but practicing. As the days passed, Billy discovered that it was much easier to say she would change things than it was really to change them. She changed herself, it is true, her clothes, her habits, her words, and her thoughts, but it was more difficult to change Bertram. In the first place, he was there so little. She was dismayed when she saw how very little indeed he was at home, and she did not like to ask him outright to stay. That was not in accordance with her plans. Besides, the Talk to Young Wives said that indirect influence was much to be preferred always to direct persuasion, which last, indeed, usually failed to produce results. So Billy dressed up and practiced and talked of anything but the baby, and even hinted shamelessly once or twice that she would like to go to the theater, but all to little avail. True, Bertram brightened up for a minute when he came home and found her in a new or a favorite dress, and he told her how pretty she looked. He appeared to like to have her play to him, too, even declaring once or twice that it was quite like old times. Yes, it was. But he never noticed her hints about the theater, and he did not seem to like to talk about his work even a little. Billy laid this last fact to his injured arm. She decided that he had become blue and discouraged, and that he needed cheering up, especially about his work. So she determinedly and systematically set herself to doing it. She talked of the fine work he had done, and of the still finer work he would yet do when his arm was well. She told him how proud she was of him, and she let him see how dear his art was to her, and how badly she would feel if she thought he had really lost all his interest in his work and would never paint again. She questioned him about the new portrait he was to begin as soon as his arm would let him, and she tried to arouse his enthusiasm in the picture he had planned to show in the March exhibition of the Bohemian Tin, telling him that she was sure his arm would allow him to complete at least one canvas to hang. In none of this, however, did Bertram appear to be the least interested. The one thing, indeed, which he seemed not to want to talk about was his work, and he responded to her overtures on the subject with only moody silence or else with almost irritable monosyllables, all of which not only grieved but surprised Billy very much, for, according to the Talk to the Young Wives, she was doing exactly what the ideal, sympathetic, interested in her husband's work wife should do. When February came, bringing with it no change for the better, Billy was thoroughly frightened. Bertram's arm plainly was not improving. He was more gloomy and restless than ever. He seemed not to want to stay at home at all, and Billy knew now for a certainty that he was spending more and more time with Bob Seaver and the boys. Poor Billy! Nowhere could she look these days and see happiness. Even the adored baby seemed, at times, almost to give an added pang. Had he not become, according to the Talk to Young Wives, that awful thing, a wedge? The annex, too, carried its sting, for where was the need of an overflow house for happiness now, when there was no happiness to overflow? Even the little jade idol on Billy's mantel Billy could not bear to see these days, for its once bland smile had become a hideous grin, demanding, "Where now is your heap-penny velly good lucky?" But before Bertram, Billy still carried a bravely smiling face, and to him still she talked earnestly and enthusiastically of his work, which last, as it happened, was the worst course she could have pursued, for the one thing poor Bertram wished to forget just now was his work. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 28. Conspirators. Early in February came Arkwright's appearance at the Boston Opera House, the first since he had sung there as a student a few years before. He was an immediate and an unquestioned success. His portrait adorned the first page of almost every Boston newspaper the next morning, and captious critics vied with each other to do him honor. His full history, from boyhood up, was featured with special emphasis on his recent triumphs in New York and foreign capitals. He was interviewed as to his opinion on everything from vegetarianism to woman suffrage, and his preferences as to pies and pastimes were given headline prominence. There was no doubt of it. Mr. M.J. Arkwright was a star. All Arkwright's old friends, including Billy, Bertram, Cyril, Marie, Calderwell, Alice Greggory, Aunt Hannah, and Tommy Dunn, went to hear him sing, and after the performance he held a miniature reception with enough adulation to turn his head completely around, he declared depreciatingly. Not until the next evening, however, did he have an opportunity for what he called a real talk with any of his friends. Then, in Calderwell's room, he settled back in his chair with a sigh of content. For a time his own and Calderwell's affairs occupied their attention. Then, after a short pause, the tenor asked abruptly, "Is there anything wrong with the Henshaws, Calderwell?" Calderwell came suddenly erect in his chair. "Thank you. I hoped you'd introduce that subject. Though, for that matter, if you hadn't, I should. Yes, there is, and I'm looking to you, old man, to get them out of it." "I?" Arkwright sat erect now. "Yes." "What do you mean?" "In a way, the expected has happened, though I know now that I didn't really expect it to happen, in spite of my prophecies. You may remember I was always skeptical on the subject of Bertram's settling down to a domestic hearthstone. I insisted 'twould be the turn of a girl's head and the curve of her cheek that he wanted to paint. Arkwright looked up with a quick frown. "You don't mean that Henshaw has been cad enough to find another—" Calderwell threw up his hand. "No, not that. We haven't that to deal with yet, thank goodness. There's no woman in it, and really, when you come right down to it, if ever a fellow had an excuse to seek diversion, Bertram Henshaw has, poor chap. It's just this. Bertram broke his arm again last October. Yes, so I heard, and I thought he was looking badly. He is. It's a bad business. 'Twas improperly set in the first place, and it's not doing well now. In fact, I'm told on pretty good authority that the doctor says he probably will never use it again." "Oh, by George! Calderwell!" "Yes, tough, isn't it? Especially when you think of his work, and know, as I happen to, that he's particularly dependent on his right hand for everything. He doesn't tell this generally, and I understand Billy and the family know nothing of it, how hopeless the case is. I mean, well, naturally the poor fellow has been pretty thoroughly discouraged, and to get away from himself he's gone back to his old bohemian habits, spending much of his time with some of his old cronies that are none too good for him. Seaver, for instance." "Bob Seaver? Yes, I know him." Arkwright's lips snapped together crisply. "Yes, he said he knew you. That's why I'm counting on your help." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want you to get Henshaw away from him, and keep him away." Arkwright's face darkened with an angry flush. "Great Scott, Calderwell! What are you talking about? Henshaw is no kid to be toted home, and I'm no nursery governess to do the toting." Calderwell laughed quietly. "No, I don't think anyone would take you for a nursery governess, Arkwright, in spite of the fact that you are still known to some of your friends as Mary Jane. But you can sing a song, man, which will promptly give you a thorough ticket to their innermost sacred circle. In fact, to my certain knowledge, Seaver is already planning a jamboree with you at the right hand of the toastmaster. There's your chance. Once in, stay in, long enough to get Henshaw out." "But, good heavens, Calderwell, it's impossible," demanded Arkwright savagely. "I can't walk up to the man, take him by the ear, and say, 'Here you, sir, march home.' Neither can I come the 'I am holier than thou' act, and hold him up to the mirror of his transgressions. No, but you can get him out of it some way. You can find a way, for Billy's sake." There was no answer, and after a moment Calderwell went on more quietly. "I haven't seen Billy but 2 or 3 times since I came back to Boston. But I don't need to. I know that she's breaking her heart over something, and of course that something is Bertram." There was still no answer. Arkwright got up suddenly and walked to the window. "You see, I'm helpless," resumed Calderwell. "I don't paint pictures, nor sing songs, nor write stories, nor dance jigs for a living, and you have to do one or another to be in with that set. And it's got to be a Johnny-on-the-spot with Bertram. All is, something will have to be done to get him out of the state of mind and body he's in now, or—" Arkwright wheeled sharply. "When did you say this jamboree was going to be?" he demanded. "Next week sometime. The date is not settled. They were going to consult you." Commented Arkwright, and though his next remark was a complete change of subject, Calderwell gave a contented sigh. If, when the proposition was first made to him, Arkwright was doubtful of his ability to be a successful Johnny-on-the-spot, he was even more doubtful of it as the days passed, and he was attempting to carry out the suggestion. He had known that he was undertaking a most difficult and delicate task, and he soon began to fear that it was an impossible one as well. With a dogged persistence, however, he adhered to his purpose, ever on the alert to be more watchful, more tactful, more efficient in emergencies. Disagreeable as was the task in a way, in another way it was a great pleasure to him. He was glad of the opportunity to do anything for Billy, and then, too, he was glad of something absorbing enough to take his mind off his own affairs. He told himself sometimes that this helping another man to fight his tiger skin was assisting himself to fight his own. Arkwright was trying very hard not to think of Alice Greggory these days. He had come back hoping that he was in a measure cured of his folly, as he termed it, but the first look into Alice Greggory's blue-gray eyes had taught him the fallacy of that idea. In that very first meeting with Alice, he feared that he had revealed his secret, for she was plainly so nervously distant and ill at ease with him that he could but construe her embarrassment and chilly dignity as pity for him and a desire to show him that she had nothing but friendship for him. Since then he had seen but little of her, partly because he did not wish to see her, and partly because his time was so fully occupied. Then, too, in a roundabout way, he had heard a rumor that Calderwell was engaged to be married, and though no feminine name had been mentioned in connection with the story, Arkwright had not hesitated to supply in his own mind that of Alice Greggory. Beginning with the jamboree, which came off quite in accordance with Calderwell's prophecies, Arkwright spent the most of such time as was not given to his professional duties in deliberately cultivating the society of Bertram and his friends. To this extent he met with no difficulty, for he found that M. J. Arkwright, the new star in the operatic firmament, was obviously a welcome comrade. Beyond this it was not so easy. Arkwright wondered, indeed, sometimes if he were making any progress at all, but still he persevered. He walked with Bertram, he talked with Bertram, unobtrusively he contrived to be near Bertram almost always when they were together with the boys. Gradually he won from him the story of what the surgeon had said to him, and of how black the future looked in consequence. This established a new bond between them, so potent that Arkwright ventured to test it one day by telling Bertram the story of the tiger skin, the first tiger skin in his uncle's library years ago, and of how, since then, any difficulty he had encountered he had tried to treat as a tiger skin. In telling the story, he was careful to draw no moral for his listener, and to preach no sermon. He told the tale, too, with all possible whimsical lightness of touch, and immediately at its conclusion he changed the subject. But that he had not failed utterly in his design was evidenced a few days later, when Bertram grimly declared that he guessed his tiger skin was a lively beast all right. The first time Arkwright went home with Bertram, his presence was almost a necessity. Bertram was not quite himself that night. Billy admitted them. She had plainly been watching and waiting. Arkwright never forgot the look on her face as her eyes met his. There was a curious mixture of terror, hurt pride, relief, and shame, overtopped by a fierce loyalty which almost seemed to say aloud the words, "Don't you dare to blame him." Arkwright's heart ached with sympathy and admiration at the proudly courageous way in which Billy carried off the next few painful minutes. Even when he bade her good night a little later, only her eyes said thank you. Her lips were dumb. Arkwright often went home with Bertram after that. Not that it was always necessary, far from it. Some time, indeed, elapsed before he had quite the same excuse again for his presence, but he had found that occasionally he could get Bertram home earlier by adroit suggestions of one kind or another, and more frequently he was succeeding in getting him home for a game of chess. Bertram liked chess and was a fine player. Since breaking his arm, he had turned to games with the feverish eagerness of one who looks for something absorbing to fill an unrestful mind. It was Seaver's skill in chess that had at first attracted Bertram to the man long ago, but Bertram could beat him easily, too easily for much pleasure in it now, so they did not play chess often these days. Bertram had found that, in spite of his injury, he could still take part in other games, and some of them, if not so intricate as chess, were at least more apt to take his mind off himself, especially if there were a bit of money up to add zest and interest. As it happened, however, Bertram learned one day that Arkwright could play chess, and play well too, as he discovered after their first game together. This fact contributed not a little to such success as Arkwright was having in his efforts to wean Bertram from his undesirable companions, for Bertram soon found out that Arkwright was more than a match for himself, and the occasional games he did succeed in winning only whetted his appetite for more. Many an evening now, therefore, was spent by the two men in Bertram's den, with Billy anxiously hovering near, her eyes lovingly watching either her husband's absorbed face or the pretty little red and white ivory figures which seemed to possess so wonderful a power to hold his attention. In spite of her joy at the chessmen's efficacy in keeping Bertram at home, however, she was almost jealous of them. "Mr. Arkwright, couldn't you show me how to play sometime?" she said wistfully one evening, when the momentary absence of Bertram had left the two alone together. "I used to watch Bertram and Marie play years ago, but I never knew how to play myself. Not that I can see what the fun is in just sitting and staring at a chessboard for half an hour at a time, though. But Bertram likes it, so I want to learn to stare with him. Will you teach me?" "I should be glad to," smiled Arkwright. "Then will you come maybe sometimes when Bertram is at the doctor's? He goes every Tuesday and Friday at 3 o'clock for treatment. I'd rather you came then for two reasons. First, because I don't want Bertram to know I'm learning till I can play some, and secondly, because I don't want to take you away from him." The last words were spoken very low, and were accompanied by a painful blush. It was the first time Billy had ever hinted to Arkwright in words that she understood what he was trying to do. "I'll come next Tuesday," promised Arkwright, with a cheerfully unobservant air. Then Bertram came in, bringing the book of chess problems for which he had gone upstairs. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 29. Chess. Promptly at 3 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, Arkwright appeared at the Strata, and for the next hour Billy did her best to learn the names and the moves of the pretty little ivory men. But at the end of the hour she was almost ready to give up in despair. If there weren't so many kinds, and if they didn't all insist on doing something different, it wouldn't be so bad, she sighed. But how can you be expected to remember which goes diagonal, and which crisscrosses, and which can't go but one square, and which can skip way across the board, especially when that little pawn thing can go straight ahead 2 squares sometimes, and the next minute only 1, except when it takes things, and then it goes crooked 1 square. And when that tiresome little horse tries to go all ways at once, and you can jump round and hurdle over anybody's head, even the king's, how can you expect folks to remember? But then Bertram remembers, she added resolutely, so I guess I can. Whenever possible after that, Arkwright came on Tuesdays and Fridays, and in spite of her doubts, Billy did very soon begin to remember. Spurred by her great desire to play with Bertram and surprise him, Billy spared no pains to learn well her lessons. Even among the baby's books and playthings these days might be found a manual of chess, for Billy pursued her study at all hours, and some nights even her dreams were of ruined castles where kings and queens and bishops disported themselves, with pawns for servants, and where a weird knight on horseback used the castle's highest tower for a hurdle, landing always 100 yards to one side of where he would be expected to come down. It was not long, of course, before Billy could play a game of chess after a fashion, but she knew just enough to realize that she actually knew nothing, and she knew, too, that until she could play a really good game, her moves would not hold Bertram's attention for 1 minute. Not at present, therefore, was she willing Bertram should know what she was attempting to do. Billy had not yet learned what the great surgeon had said to Bertram. She knew only that his arm was no better, and that he never voluntarily spoke of his painting. Over her now seemed to be hanging a vague horror. Something was the matter. She knew that. But what it was she could not fathom. She realized that Arkwright was trying to help, and her gratitude, though silent, knew no bounds. Not even to Aunt Hannah or Uncle William could she speak of this thing that was troubling her. That they, too, understood in a measure she realized, but still she said no word. Billy was wearing a proud little air of aloofness these days that was heartbreaking to those who saw it and read it aright for what it was: loyalty to Bertram no matter what happened. And so Billy pored over her chessboard feverishly, tirelessly, having ever before her longing eyes the dear time when Bertram, across the table from her, should sit happily staring for half an hour at a move she had made. Whatever Billy's chess-playing was to signify, however, in her own life, it was destined to play a part in the lives of two friends of hers that was most unexpected. During Billy's very first lesson, as it chanced, Alice Greggory called and found Billy and Arkwright so absorbed in their game that they did not at first hear Eliza speak her name. The quick color that flew to Arkwright's face at sight of herself was construed at once by Alice as embarrassment on his part at being found tete-a-tete with Bertram Henshaw's wife, and she did not like it. She was not pleased that he was there. She was less pleased that he blushed for being there. It so happened that Alice found him there again several times. Alice gave a piano lesson at 2 o'clock every Tuesday and Friday afternoon to a little Beacon Street neighbor of Billy's, and she had fallen into the habit of stepping in to see Billy for a few minutes afterward, which brought her there at a little past 3, just after the chess lesson was well started. If, the first time that Alice Greggory found Arkwright opposite Billy at the chess table, she was surprised and displeased, the second and third times she was much more so. When it finally came to her one day with sickening illumination that always the tete-a-tetes were during Bertram's hour at the doctor's, she was appalled. What could it mean? Had Arkwright given up his fight? Was he playing false to himself and to Bertram by trying thus on the sly to win the love of his friend's wife? Was this man, whom she had so admired for his brave stand, and to whom, all unasked, she had given her heart's best love, more the pity of it, was this idol of hers to show feet of clay after all? She could not believe it, and yet, sick at heart, but imbued with the determination of a righteous cause, Alice Greggory resolved, for Billy's sake, to watch and wait. If necessary, she should speak to someone, though to whom she did not know. Billy's happiness should not be put in jeopardy if she could help it. Indeed, no. As the weeks passed, Alice came to be more and more uneasy, distressed, and grieved. Of Billy she could believe no evil, but of Arkwright she was beginning to think she could believe everything that was dishonorable and despicable. And to believe that of the man she still loved, no wonder that Alice did not look nor act like herself these days. Incensed at herself because she did love him, angry at him because he seemed to be proving himself so unworthy of that love, and genuinely frightened at what she thought was the fast approaching wreck of all happiness for her dear friend Billy, Alice did not know which way to turn. At first she had told herself confidently that she would speak to somebody, but as time passed she saw the impracticability of that idea. Speak to somebody, indeed! To whom? When? Where? What should she say? Where was her right to say anything? She was not dealing with a parcel of naughty children who had pilfered the cake jar. She was dealing with grown men and women who presumably knew their own affairs, and who certainly would resent any interference from her. On the other hand, could she stand calmly by and see Bertram lose his wife, Arkwright his honor, Billy her happiness, and herself her faith in human nature, all because to do otherwise would be to meddle in other people's business? Apparently she could, and should. At least, that seemed to be the role which she was expected to play. It was when Alice had reached this unhappy frame of mind that Arkwright himself unexpectedly opened the door for her. The two were alone together in Bertram Henshaw's den. It was Tuesday afternoon. Alice had called to find Billy and Arkwright deep in their usual game of chess. Then a matter of domestic affairs had taken Billy from the room. "I'm afraid I'll have to be gone 10 minutes or more," she had said, as she rose from the table reluctantly. "But you might be showing Alice the moves, Mr. Arkwright," she had added with a laugh as she disappeared. "Shall I teach you the moves?" he had smiled when they were alone together. Alice's reply was so indignantly short and sharp that Arkwright, after a moment's pause, had said with a whimsical smile that yet carried a touch of sadness, "I am forced to surmise from your answer that you think it is you who should be teaching me moves. At all events, I seem to have been making some moves lately that have not suited you, judging by your actions. Have I offended you in any way, Alice?" The girl turned with a quick lifting of her head. Alice knew that if ever she were to speak, it must be now. Never again could she hope for such an opportunity as this. Suddenly throwing circumspect caution quite aside, she determined that she would speak. Springing to her feet, she crossed the room and seated herself in Billy's chair at the chess table. "Me offend me!" she exclaimed in a low voice, "as if I were the one you were offending." "Why, Alice!" murmured the man in obvious stupefaction. Alice raised her hand, palm outward. "Now please don't pretend you don't know," she begged almost piteously. "Please don't add that to all the rest. Oh, I understand. Of course, it's none of my affairs, and I wasn't going to speak," she choked. "But today, when you gave me this chance, I had to. At first I couldn't believe it," she plunged on, plainly hurrying against Billy's return. "After all you told me of how you meant to fight it, your tiger skin, and I thought it merely happened that you were here alone with her those days I came. Then, when I found out they were always the days Mr. Henshaw was away at the doctor's, I had to believe." She stopped for breath. Arkwright, who up to this moment had shown that he was completely mystified as to what she was talking about, suddenly flushed a painful red. He was obviously about to speak, but she prevented him with a quick gesture. "There's more I've got to say, please. As if it weren't bad enough to do what you're doing at all, but you must needs take it at such a time as this, when her husband isn't doing just what he ought to do, and we all know it. It's so unfair to take her now, to try to win, and you aren't even fair with him," she protested tremulously. "You pretend to be his friend. You go with him everywhere. It's just as if you were helping to pull him down. You're one with the whole bunch." The blood suddenly receded from Arkwright's face, leaving it very white. But if Alice saw it, she paid no heed. "Everybody says you are. Then to come here like this, on the sly, when you know he can't be here. Oh, can't you see what you're doing?" There was a moment's pause. Then Arkwright spoke. A deep pain looked from his eyes. He was still very pale, and his mouth had settled into sad lines. "I think perhaps it may be just as well if I tell you what I am doing, or rather trying to do," he said quietly. Then he told her. "And so you see," he added, when he had finished the tale, "I haven't really accomplished much, after all, and it seems the little I have accomplished has led only to my being misjudged by you, my best friend." Alice gave a sobbing cry. Her face was scarlet. Horror, shame, and relief struggled for mastery in her countenance. "Oh, but I didn't know," she moaned, twisting her hands nervously. "And now, when you've been so brave, so true, for me to accuse you of Oh, can you ever forgive me? But knowing that you did care for her, it did look—" She choked into silence and turned away her head. He glanced at her tenderly, mournfully. "Yes," he said after a minute, in a low voice, "I can see how it did look, and so I'm going to tell you now something I had meant never to tell you. There really couldn't have been anything in that, you see, for I found out long ago that it was gone, whatever love there had been for Billy. But your tiger skin. Oh, yes, I thought it was alive, smiled Arkwright sadly, when I asked you to help me fight it. But one day, very suddenly, I discovered that it was nothing but a dead skin of dreams and memories. But I made another discovery, too. I found that just beyond lay another one, and that was very much alive. Another one? Alice turned to him in wonder. But you never asked me to help you fight that one. He shook his head. No, I couldn't, you see. You couldn't have helped me. You'd only have hindered me. Hindered you? Yes. You see, it was my love for you that I was fighting then. Alice gave a low cry and flushed vividly, but Arkwright hurried on, his eyes turned away. Oh, I understand. I know. I'm not asking for anything. I heard some time ago of your engagement to Calderwell. I've tried many times to say the proper, expected, pretty speeches, but I couldn't. I will now, though. I do. You have all my tenderest, best wishes for your happiness, dear. If long ago I hadn't been such a blind fool as not to know my own heart. But there's some mistake, interposed Alice, palpitatingly, with hanging head. I'm not engaged to Mr. Calderwell. Arkwright turned and sent a keen glance into her face. You're not? No. But I heard that Calderwell— He stopped helplessly. You heard that Mr. Calderwell was engaged, very likely. But it so happens he isn't engaged to me, murmured Alice faintly. But long ago you said— Arkwright paused, his eyes still keenly searching her face. Never mind what I said long ago, laughed Alice, trying unsuccessfully to meet his gaze. One says lots of things at times, you know. Into Arkwright's eyes came a new light, a light that plainly needed but a breath to fan it into quick fire. Alice, he said softly, do you mean that maybe now I needn't try to fight that other tiger skin? There was no answer. Arkwright reached out a pleading hand. Alice, dear, I've loved you so long, he begged unsteadily. Don't you think that sometime, if I was very, very patient, you could just begin to care a little for me? Still there was no answer. Then, slowly, Alice shook her head. Her face was turned quite away, which was a pity, for if Arkwright could have seen the sudden tender mischief in her eyes, his own would not have become so sober. Not even a little bit? I couldn't ever begin, answered a half-smothered voice. Alice, cried the man, heart-brokenly. Alice turned now, and for a fleeting instant let him see her eyes, glowing with the love so long kept in relentless exile. I couldn't, because, you see, I began long ago, she whispered. Alice! It was the same single word, but spoken with a world of difference, for into it now was crowded all the glory and the wonder of a great love. Alice! breathed the man again, and this time the word was, oh, so tenderly whispered, into the little pink and white ear of the girl in his arms. I got delayed, began Billy in the doorway. Oh, she broke off, beating a hushed but precipitate retreat. Fully 30 minutes later, Billy came to the door again. This time her approach was heralded by a snatch of song. I hope you'll excuse my being gone so long, she smiled as she entered the room, where her two guests sat decorously face to face at the chess table. Well, you know you said you'd be gone 10 minutes, Arkwright reminded her politely. Yes, I know I did. And Billy, to her credit, did not even smile at the man who did not know 10 minutes from 50. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Miss Billy Married. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Miss Billy Married by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 30. By a Baby's Hand. After all, it was the baby's hand that did it, as was proper, and perhaps to be expected. For surely was it not Bertram Jr.'s place to show his parents that he was indeed no Wedge, but a dear and precious tie, binding two loving, loyal hearts more and more closely together? It would seem, indeed, that Bertram, Jr. thought so, perhaps, and very bravely he set about it, though to carry out his purpose he had to turn his steps into an unfamiliar way, a way of pain and weariness and danger. It was Arkwright who told Bertram that the baby was very sick, and that Billy wanted him. Bertram went home at once to find a distracted, white-faced Billy, and a twisted, pain-racked little creature who it was almost impossible to believe was the happy, laughing baby boy he had left that morning. For the next 2 weeks nothing was thought of in the silent old Beacon Street house but the tiny little life hovering so near death's door that twice it appeared to have slipped quite across the threshold. All through those terrible weeks it seemed as if Billy neither ate nor slept, and always at her side, comforting, cheering, and helping whenever possible, was Bertram, tender, loving, and marvelously thoughtful. Then came the turning point, when the universe itself appeared to hang upon a baby's breath. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, came the fluttering back of the tiny spirit into the longing arms stretched so far, far out to meet it and hold it, and the father and the mother, looking into each other's sleepless, dark-ringed eyes, knew that their son was once more theirs to love and cherish. When two have gone together with a dear one down into the valley of the shadow of death, and have come back either mourning or rejoicing, they find a different world from the one they had left. Things that were great before seem small, and some things that were small seem great. At least Bertram and Billy found their world thus changed when together they came back, bringing their son with them. In the long weeks of convalescence, when the healthy rosiness stole bit by bit into the baby's waxen face, and the light of recognition and understanding crept day by day into the baby's eyes, there was many a quiet hour for heart-to-heart talks between the two who so anxiously and joyously hailed every rosy tint and fleeting sparkle. And there was so much to tell, so much to hear, so much to talk about. And always running through everything was that golden thread of joy, besides which all else paled, that they had baby and each other, as if anything else mattered. To be sure, there was Bertram's arm. Very early in their talks Billy found out about that. But Billy, with baby getting well, was not to be daunted even by this. "Nonsense, darling! Not paint again, indeed! Why, Bertram, of course you will," she cried confidently. "But Billy, the doctor said—" began Bertram, but Billy would not even listen. "Very well, what if he did, dear?" she interrupted. "What if he did say you couldn't use your right arm much again?" Billy's voice broke a little, then quickly steadied into something very much like triumph. "You've got your left one." Bertram shook his head. "I can't paint with that." "Yes, you can," insisted Billy firmly. "Why, Bertram, what do you suppose you were given 2 arms for, if not to fight with both of them? And I'm going to be ever so much prouder of what you paint now, because I'll know how splendidly you work to do it. Besides, there's Baby. As if you weren't ever going to paint for Baby. Why, Bertram, I'm going to have you paint Baby one of these days. Think how pleased he'll be to see it when he grows up. He's nicer anyhow than any old face of a girl you ever did. Paint? Why, Bertram, darling, of course you're going to paint, and better than you ever did before." Bertram shook his head again, but this time he smiled, and patted Billy's cheek with the tip of his forefinger. "As if I could!" he disclaimed. But that afternoon he went into his long deserted studio and hunted up his last unfinished picture. For some time he stood motionless before it. Then, with a quick gesture of determination, he got out his palette, paints, and brushes. This time not until he had painted 10, a dozen, a score of strokes did he drop his brush with a sigh and carefully erase the fresh paint on the canvas. The next day he worked longer, and this time he allowed a very little, of what he had done to remain. The third day Billy herself found him at his easel. "I wonder, do you suppose I could?" he asked fearfully. "Why, dearest, of course you can. Haven't you noticed? Can't you see how much more you can do with your left hand now? You've had to use it, you see, and I've seen you do a lot of things with it lately that you never used to do at all. And, of course, the more you do with it, the more you can." "I know, but that doesn't mean that I can paint with it," sighed Bertram, ruefully eyeing the tiny bit of fresh color his canvas showed for his long afternoon's work. "You wait and see," nodded Billy, with so overwhelming a cheery confidence that Bertram, looking into her glowing face, was conscious of a curious throb of exultation, almost as if already the victory were his. But it was not always of Bertram's broken arm, nor even of his work that they talked. Bertram, hanging over the baby's crib to assure himself that the rosiness and the sparkle were really growing more apparent every day, used to wonder sometimes how ever in the world he could have been jealous of his son. He said as much one day to Billy. To Billy it was a most astounding idea. "You mean you were actually jealous of your own baby?" she gasped. "Why, Bertram, how could— And was that why you sought distraction and— Oh, but Bertram, that was all my fault," she quavered remorsefully. "I wouldn't play, nor sing, nor go to walk, nor anything, and I wore horrid frowsy wrappers all the time, and—" "Oh, come, Billy," expostulated the man. "I'm not going to have you talk like that about my wife." "But I did. The book said I did," wailed Billy. "The book? Good heavens, are there books in this, too?" demanded Bertram. "Yes, the same one. The Talks to Young Wives," nodded Billy. And then, because some things had grown small to them, and some others great, they both laughed happily. But even this was not quite all, for one evening, very shyly, Billy brought out the chessboard. "Of course I can't play well," she faltered, "and maybe you don't want to play with me at all." But Bertram, when he found out why she had learned, was very sure he did want very much to play with her. Billy did not beat, of course. She did several times experience for a few blissful minutes the pleasure of seeing Bertram sit motionless, studying the board because of a move she had made, and though in the end her king was ignominiously trapped, with not an unguarded square upon which to set his poor distracted foot, the memory of those blissful minutes when she had made Bertram stare more than paid for the final checkmate. By the middle of June the baby was well enough to be taken to the beach, and Bertram was so fortunate as to secure the same house they had occupied before. Once again William went down in Maine for his fishing trip, and the Strata was closed. In the beach house Bertram was painting industriously with his left hand. Almost he was beginning to feel Billy's enthusiasm. Almost he was believing that he was doing good work. It was not the face of a girl now. It was the face of a baby, smiling, laughing, even crying sometimes. At other times just gazing straight into your eyes with adorable soberness. Bertram still went into Boston twice a week for treatment, though the treatment itself had changed. The great surgeon had sent him to still another specialist. "There's a chance, though perhaps a small one," he had said. "I'd like you to try it, anyway." As the summer advanced, Bertram thought sometimes that he could see a slight improvement in his injured arm, but he tried not to think too much about this. He had thought the same thing before, only to be disappointed in the end. Besides, he was undeniably interested just now in seeing if he could paint with his left hand. Billy was sure, and she had said that she would be prouder than ever of him if he could, and he would like to make Billy proud. Then, too, there was the baby. He had no idea a baby could be so interesting to paint. He was not sure but that he was going to like to paint babies even better than he had liked to paint his face of a girl that had brought him his first fame. In September the family returned to the Strata. The move was made a little earlier this year on account of Alice Greggory's wedding. Alice was to be married in the pretty living room at the Annex, just where Billy herself had been married a few short years before. And Billy had made great plans for the wedding, not all of which he was able to carry out, for Alice, like Marie before her, had very strong objections to being placed under too great obligations. "And you see, really, anyway," she told Billy, "I owe the whole thing to you to begin with, even my husband." "Nonsense! Of course you don't," disputed Billy. "But I do. If it hadn't been for you, I should never have found him again, and of course I shouldn't have had this dear little home to be married in. And I never could have left Mother if she hadn't had Aunt Hannah and the Annex, which means you. And if I hadn't found Mr. Arkwright, I might never have known how I could go back to my old home, as I am going on my honeymoon trip, and just know that every one of my old friends who shakes hands with me isn't pitying me now because I'm my father's daughter, and that means you. For, you see, I never would have known that my father's name was cleared if it hadn't been for you. And—" "Oh, Alice, please, please," begged Billy, laughingly raising two protesting hands. "Why don't you say that it's to me you owe just breathing and be done with it?" "Well, I will then," avowed Alice doggedly, "and it's true, too, for honestly, my dear, I don't believe I would have been breathing today, nor Mother either, if you hadn't found us that morning and taken us out of those awful rooms." "I? Never! You wouldn't let me take you out," laughed Billy. "You proud little thing. Maybe you've forgotten how you turned poor Uncle William and me out into the cold, cold world that morning, just because we dared to aspire to your Lowestoft teapot. But I haven't." "Oh, Billy, please don't," begged Alice, the painful color staining her face. "If you knew how I've hated myself since for the way I acted that day, and really, you did take us away from there, you know." "No, I didn't. I merely found two good tenants for Mr. and Mrs. Delano," corrected Billy with a sober face. "Oh, yes, I know all about that," smiled Alice affectionately. "And you got Mother and me here to keep Aunt Hannah company and teach Tommy Dunn. And you got Aunt Hannah here to keep us company and take care of Tommy Dunn. And you got Tommy Dunn here so Aunt Hannah and we could have somebody to teach and take care of. And as for the others—" But Billy put her hands to her ears and fled. The wedding was to be on the 15th. From the West, Kate wrote that of course it was none of her affairs, particularly as neither of the interested parties was a relation, but still she should think that for a man in Mr. Arkwright's position nothing but a church wedding would do at all, as, of course, he did in a way belong to the public. Alice, however, declared that perhaps he did belong to the public when he was Don somebody or other in doublet and hose, but when he was just plain Michael Jeremiah Arkwright in a frock coat, he was hers, and she did not propose to make a grand opera show of her wedding. And as Arkwright, too, very much disapproved of the church wedding idea, the two were married in the Annex living room at noon on the 15th as originally planned, in spite of Mrs. Kate Hartwell's letter. It was soon after the wedding that Bertram told Billy he wished she would sit for him with Bertram Jr. "I want to try my hand at you both together," he coaxed. "Why, of course, if you like, dear," agreed Billy promptly. "Though I think Baby is just as nice, and even nicer alone." Once again, all over Bertram's studio began to appear sketches of Billy, this time a glorified, tender Billy, with the wonderful mother love in her eyes. Then, after several sketches of trial poses, Bertram began his picture of Billy and the baby together. Even now Bertram was not sure of his work. He knew that he could not yet paint with his old freedom and ease. He knew that his stroke was not so sure, so untrammeled. But he knew, too, that he had gained wonderfully during the summer, and that he was gaining now every day. To Billy he said nothing of all this. Even to himself he scarcely put his hope into words. But in his heart he knew that what he was really painting his mother and child picture for was the Bohemian Ten Club exhibition in March, if he could but put upon canvas the vision that was spurring him on. And so Bertram worked all through those short winter days, not always upon the one picture, of course, but upon some picture or sketch that would help to give his still uncertain left hand the skill that had belonged to its mate. And always cheering, encouraging, insisting on victory was Billy, so that even had Bertram been tempted sometimes to give up, he could not have done so and faced Billy's aggrieved, disappointed eyes. And when at last his work was completed, and the pictured mother and child in all their marvelous life and beauty seemed ready to step from the canvas, Billy drew a long, ecstatic breath. "Oh, Bertram, it is the best work you have ever done!" Billy was looking at the baby. Always she had ignored herself as part of the picture. "And won't it be fine for the exhibition?" Bertram's hand tightened on the chair back in front of him. For a moment he could not speak. Then, a bit huskily, he asked, "Would you dare risk it?" "Risk it? Why, Bertram Henshaw, I've meant that picture for the exhibition from the very first, only I never dreamed you could get it so perfectly lovely. Now, what do you say about Baby being nicer than any old Face of a Girl that you ever did?" she triumphed. And Bertram, who even to himself had not dared whisper the word exhibition, gave a tremulous laugh that was almost a sob, so overwhelming was his sudden realization of what faith and confidence had meant to Billy, his wife. If there was still a lingering doubt in Bertram's mind, it must have been dispelled in less than an hour after the Bohemian Ten Club exhibition flung open its doors on its opening night. Once again Bertram found his pictures the cynosure of all admiring eyes, and himself the center of an enthusiastic group of friends and fellow artists who vied with each other in hearty words of congratulation. And when, later, the feared critics, whose names and opinions counted for so much in his world, had their say in the daily press and weekly reviews, Bertram knew how surely indeed he had won. And when he read that Henshaw's work shows how a peculiar strength, a sort of reserve power, as it were, which, beautiful as was his former work, it never showed before, he smiled grimly and said to Billy, "I suppose now that was the fighting I did with my good left hand, eh, dear?" But there was yet one more drop that was to make Bertram's cup of joy brim to overflowing. It came just 1 month after the exhibition, in the shape of a terse dozen words from the doctor. Bertram fairly flew home that day. He had no consciousness of any means of locomotion. He thought he was going to tell his wife at once his great good news, but when he saw her, speech suddenly fled, and all that he could do was to draw her closely to him with his left arm and hide his face. "Why, Bertram, dearest, what is it?" stammered the thoroughly frightened Billy. "Has anything happened?" No. Yes, everything has happened. I mean, it's going to happen," choked the man. "Billy, that old chap says that I'm going to have my arm again. Think of it, my good right arm that I've lost so long." "Oh, Bertram," breathed Billy, and she, too, fell to sobbing. Later, when speech was more coherent, she faltered, "Well, anyway, it doesn't make any difference how many beautiful pictures you paint after this, Bertram. I can't be prouder of any than I am of the one your left hand did. Oh, but I have you to thank for all that, dear." "No, you haven't," disputed Billy, blinking teary eyes. "But—" She paused, then went on spiritedly, "But anyhow, I don't believe anyone, not even Kate, can say now that I've been a hindrance to you in your career." "Hindrance?" scoffed Bertram, in a tone that left no room for doubt, and with a kiss that left even less, if possible. Billy, for still another minute, was silent. Then, with a wistfulness that was half playful, half serious, she sighed. "Bertram, I believe being married is something like clocks, you know, especially at the first." "Clocks, dear?" "Yes. I was out to Aunt Hannah's to-day. She was fussing with her clock, the one that strikes half an hour ahead, and I saw all those quantities of wheels, little and big, that have to go just so, with all the little cogs fitting into all the other little cogs just exactly right. Well, that's like marriage. See, there's such a lot of little cogs in everyday life that have to be fitted so they'll run smoothly, that have to be adjusted, especially at the first. Oh, Billy, what an idea! But it's so, really, Bertram. Anyhow, I know my cogs were always getting out of place at the first, laughed Billy. And I was like Aunt Hannah's clock, too, always going off half an hour ahead of time. And maybe I shall be so again sometimes, but Bertram, her voice shook a little, if you'll just look at my face, you'll see that I tell the right time there, just as Aunt Hannah's clock does. I'm sure always I'll tell the right time there, even if I do go off half an hour ahead. As if I didn't know that, answered Bertram, very low and tenderly. Besides, I reckon I have some cogs of my own that need adjusting. End of chapter 30. End of Miss Billy Married, by Eleanor H. Porter.